Hey there, and welcome back. If the day has emptied you out and you are ready to lay it down at last, then you have come to the right place, and you can let the rest of it go now. This is one of those nights for setting the present aside and travelling a long way back into the deep centuries of the English Middle Ages, into an age of castles and crusades and crowned heads, far from the small worries of your own evening. Tonight I want to tell you not the story of a single life, but the story of a whole family, the longest reigning dynasty England has ever known. A line of monarchs that held the throne for more than 300 years and shaped the land into something like the shape it has kept ever since. They were called the Plantagenets, and they came, by their own legend, from the line of a devil, and they ended in the mud of a midland field with a crown. So the story goes, hanging in a thorn bush. Let your shoulders drop. Let the bed take your weight. We have 3 centuries to cross tonight, from a sprig of yellow broom worn in a French count's cap to the last of the line cut down in battle. And it is a tale of brilliance and blood, and long ambition, such as no other family in English history can match. Before we begin, I would like to know where you are listening from tonight. The town, the country, whatever lies in the dark beyond your window as you settle in. Wherever you are, and whatever the hour shows on your side of the world, you are welcome here with me. If you find your way back to these evenings often, you are always welcome to subscribe so that the next one can find you when it comes. And if you ever care to leave a note below, I do look through them. And it is a quiet comfort to know who has come to sit with me in the dark. There is no hurry in any of this. The story will keep, and so will I. Picture this. A great family of warlords in the green realm of northern France, in the lands along the Loire, the Counts of Anjou, fierce and able and ambitious, holding their own among the powers of the age by sword and by marriage. From this house came the dynasty we are following tonight, and it took its title, in time, from a small thing, a habit of one of its lords. Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, the father of the family's first king, is said to have worn in his cap or his helmet a sprig of the bright yellow broom, the flowering shrub that the Latin tongue called Plantagenista, and from that sprig of broom, by a long road, came the surname Plantagenet. It is worth saying at once that the family did not call themselves by that name for centuries. It was a nickname fixed on them by later ages and taken up as a surname only near the very end of their lengthy rule. But it has stuck, and it is the title by which we know them, this line of Angevin counts, who became the monarchs of England, and it began, fittingly, for so colourful a family, with a flower worn in a cap. The Counts of Anjou were no ordinary lords, for they had risen, over generations, from petty beginnings to become one of the most formidable powers in the whole of France, and they had done it by a combination of ruthlessness, cunning, and sheer relentless energy that became almost a byword. Their lands lay in the valley of the Loire, a wealthy and a much contested country, and to hold it and expand it, the counts had fought and schemed and built castles and married shrewdly for century after century, never resting, never satisfied, pressing always at their neighbours. They had a reputation for fierceness and for a hot, ungovernable temper, and also for a restless brilliance, an inability to sit still that would pass to their royal descendants and mark the Plantagenet sovereigns to the very end of the succession. To understand the family that came to rule England, it helps to remember this long apprenticeship in the hard school of French feudal war. For the dynasty came to the English throne, not as gentle inheritors, but as the latest and greatest of a long line of fighting lords. It was through a marriage that this house of Angevin warlords gained its claim to England, and the marriage joined 2 proud and powerful bloodlines. Geoffrey of Anjou, the count who wore the broom in his cap, was married to Matilda, the daughter of the English king and the widow of an emperor, a woman of imperial dignity and iron will, who carried in her the claim to the English crown through her father. It was not, by all accounts, a happy marriage, for the two were ill-matched in age and temper and quarrelled often. But it was a momentous one, for their son would unite the inheritance of Anjou with the right to England and become the founder of a dynasty. So the Plantagenets sprang from the joining of the restless, fierce house of Anjou with the royal lineage of Norman England, and they took from both the energy and ambition of the one, the royal claim, and the cool hauteur of the other, and the mixture made something formidable indeed. The empire that the first Plantagenet king came to hold was a sprawling and an unwieldy thing, a patchwork of lands gathered by inheritance and marriage rather than a single unified state, and the holding of it was a labour without end. It stretched, as we have said, from the border of Scotland to the edge of Spain, but it was not one realm. It was England and Normandy and Anjou and Aquitaine and a clutch of other territories, each with its own laws and customs and language and sense of itself, owing loyalty to the same lord but bound to one another by little else. To govern such a collection of lands, a sovereign had to be forever in motion, crossing and recrossing the sea, showing himself now in one province and now in another, for there was no capital city from which the whole could be ruled. And a lord who stayed too protracted in one corner of his dominions risked losing his grip on the rest. This was the deep problem of the Angevin Empire, that it was held together by little more than the person and the energy of its ruler, and that what one strong king could grasp, a weaker successor might let slip. The lands had been gathered by the marriages and the conquests of one or two remarkable generations, but they had no natural unity, no ordinary institutions binding them, no shared loyalty beyond the accident of a common overlord, and they were always liable to fall apart. So the vast empire that looked so mighty on the map was in truth a fragile construction, and its fragility was shown soon enough when a king came who lacked the skill to hold it, and the whole continental dominion fell away in a few short decades. The Plantagenets would remain, for centuries, a dynasty with one foot in England and one in France, drawn always back throughout the Channel by their continental ambitions and their continental losses, and the entanglement with France that began with this gathered empire would shape and trouble the whole of their long rule. There was a darker legend attached to the house as well, and it is too good a story to pass over, though we should hold it at arm's length as the legend it is. The Counts of Anjou were said, in a tale they themselves seem to have half enjoyed, to be descended from a demon, from a mysterious and beautiful countess of long ago who married one of their ancestors and bore his children, but who could never be persuaded to stay in church for the holiest moment of the Mass. One day, the story runs, the Count had her retained by force when she made to leave, and at the touching of the holy rite she gave a mighty cry, slipped from her cloak, and flew out through a window of the church, never to be seen again, revealed at last as a thing not of this world. From her, the legend said, the Angevin counts were sprung, and they did not always trouble to deny it. One of the family's own monarchs is supposed to have laughed that they came from the devil and would go back to the devil, and a powerful churchman of the age is said to have spoken of the brood in much the same terms. We need not believe a word of it, but it tells us something true about how the house struck the folk of their own time, as a family of almost unnatural energy and ambition and temper, a brood apart, touched with something fierce that ordinary men did not have. Tales of this kind were not unique to the Angevins, for the Middle Ages delighted in stories that traced great and terrible families back to some uncanny ancestress, and more than one noble house was credited, or saddled, with a supernatural founder of just this kind. What is striking is how readily the Angevins seem to have owned their version rather than living it down, repeating and embroidering it across the generations, half in unease and half in a kind of awed pride. The chroniclers who set it down were not, for the most part, trying to slander the family. They were reaching, in the only language they had, for some explanation of a vitality that struck them as almost beyond nature. For that, in the end, is what the tale was for, a way of putting into a single vivid image what sober observers found hard to account for. The ungovernable force of this house, its brilliance and its rage. The sense that in its members some ordinary human measure had somehow been overstepped. What is striking is that the Angevins themselves seem to have taken a certain dark pride in the legend rather than denying it. There is a story that an eminent churchman of the age, exasperated by the brood's wickedness, declared that from the devil they had come and to the devil they would go. And another, that one of the Angevin rulers himself laughed, that it was no wonder his family quarrelled so, since they came from the devil and could not help returning to their kind. We should treat all of this as legend and not as history, the colourful myth-making that gathers around any famous house. There was no demon countess, and the Angevins were as human as anyone, for all their force. But the legend is worth the telling, because it captures something that the people of the time clearly felt about this house, that they were touched with a fierce and almost unnatural energy, a brilliance and a violence beyond the everyday run, a brood apart. The myth was a way of saying what the chroniclers found hard to say plainly, that there was something wild in the blood of the sovereigns who ruled them. For whatever ran in their blood, the Plantagenets were a family of extraordinary force, and to understand how they came to the English throne, we must go back to the wreck that came before them, to the decades of ruin that the English remembered with a shudder as the time when Christ and his saints slept. England in those years was torn apart by a long and bitter civil war, a struggle for the crown between two claimants of the old Norman descent, the crown who held the throne and the empress who said it was hers by right. For nearly 20 years the country was fought over and harried, the powerful lords building strongholds, without license and waging their private wars. The land suffering under the breakdown of all structure, a generation of disorder and misery that left England exhausted and longing for a strong hand. It was into the ending of this protracted anarchy that the first Plantagenet king came, a young man with a title through his mother and a will of iron, and the nation, worn out by chaos, was ready to receive him. It is worth pausing to picture the England that this family came to rule, for it was a country very different from the one we know, smaller, emptier, and greener. Its few hundreds of thousands of population scattered thinly across a land of forest and field and marsh. Most of those people lived in the countryside, in villages clustered about their fields, working the land in the ancient rhythms of the farming year, and the towns, though growing, were small by our reckoning. Even the greatest of them, a fraction of the size of a modern city. London was the largest and the richest, the chief city of the realm. But even London was a compact place by later standards, and beyond the towns lay a vast countryside of woods and wastes and open fields, of small communities living close to the soil and the seasons. It was a land still heavily wooded, with vast forests that the monarchs reserved for their hunting and protected by a harsh and a resented forest law, and a land of poor roads and slow travel, where most subjects lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, and news and goods moved at the pace of a horse or a cart or a ship. The riches of the land lay in its land and its wool, and its life was overwhelmingly rural, governed by the turning of the agricultural year, the ploughing and the sowing and the harvest, the great festivals of the church marking the seasons. Into this green and thinly peopled land, the dynasty brought their restless ambition and their wars and their law. And over the centuries of their rule, the country grew and changed, its towns swelling, its trade expanding, its institutions developing. But it remained, throughout their age, a land of villages and fields and forests, a rural world whose rhythms were older than any dynasty and would outlast them all. The civil war that had wrecked England before the Plantagenets came is worth pausing on, for its horror was the measure of how desperately the realm needed the strong rule that Henry would bring. When the old king died, leaving only a daughter, the Empress Matilda, as his lawful successor, many of the barons would not accept a woman as their ruler, and the crown was seized instead by her cousin Stephen. A charming and brave but weak and irresolute man, unable to control the mighty lords or keep the peace. Matilda would not give up her claim, and for nearly 20 years, England was torn between the two of them. A long and ruinous war in which neither side could win and the country bled. The barons, freed from the restraint of a strong ruler, built castles without license and ruled their districts like petty tyrants, waging private wars, plundering and burning and extorting, while the sovereign and the empress struggled back and forth through the land. The suffering of those years burned itself into the memory of the age, and one chronicler set down the famous words that in that time men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. So abandoned did the kingdom seem by God and by all good government. The land lay unworked, the people starved and were robbed, the roads were unsafe, and the whole fabric of order that a medieval realm depended on came apart. It was an object lesson, written in misery, in what befell a realm without a strong ruler at its head, and it shaped the country that Henry inherited. For England by the end was sick to death of anarchy, and longing for a firm hand to restore peace and system, whatever the cost. When at last a settlement was reached, by which Stephen would keep the crown for his lifetime, but Matilda's son Henry would succeed him, the nation drew breath in relief. And when Stephen died not protracted after, and the young Henry came peacefully to the throne, England was ready to welcome a strong ruler and to forgive him much for the sake of order. It is worth pausing to consider what a monarch was in the eyes of the commons of that age, for medieval kingship was something far more than mere political might. It was a sacred office, hedged about with religion and ceremony. Such a man was not simply the strongest lord, he was a hallowed ruler, set apart from other men by the holy oil laid upon him at his coronation, a rite that made him, in the thinking of the time, something more than a layman, a figure touched with the sacred, the Lord's anointed. The coronation, with its anointing and its crowning and its oaths, was a solemn religious ceremony as much as a political one, and the sovereign who emerged from it was held to reign by the will of God. Owed obedience as God's deputy in his realm, and not to be lightly set aside. This sacrosanct character of kingship is the background against which we must understand the crises of the Plantagenet age, the depositions and the murders of kings, for these were not ordinary political acts, but something close to sacrilege. The laying of hands on the Lord's consecrated. When Edward II and Richard II were deposed and done to death, and when Richard III fell at Bosworth, the men who brought them down had to wrestle with the dread of having destroyed a sacred king, and they took major care to clothe their acts in forms of law and consent, to make the deposed king seem to abdicate, to find grounds that made the deed appear lawful. The sanctity of royal rule was real to these people, and it gave the crown a strength beyond mere force, a majesty that even rebels feared to violate. And yet, across the Plantagenet centuries, that sanctity was violated again and again, as the hard facts of power overrode the awe of the hallowed crown. The tension between the holy ideal of kingship and the brutal reality of dynastic struggle runs through the whole of the dynasty's history. That young man was Henry, grandson of the old king, through his mother the empress, and he came to the throne in the year 1154 as Henry II, the first of these sovereigns. He was a figure of tremendous energy, a stocky, red-headed, restless man who could never sit still, forever in motion over his vast dominions, riding from one end of them to the other at a pace that wore out his companions and his horses alike. He had a quick and powerful mind, a furious temper, and an appetite for work and rule that few rulers have matched, and he set himself at once to the task of repairing the ruin the prolonged anarchy had left. He pulled down the unlicensed fortresses, restored the monarch's authority over the overmighty lords, rebuilt the machinery of princely government and the law, and laid foundations that would outlast him by centuries. For Henry was not only a conqueror and a ruler of lands, but a maker of law, and it is in his reign that we find the beginnings of much that would become the English common law. the system of royal courts reaching out across the realm, the sovereign's judges and the ruler's courts binding the country together under one law. Whatever else he was, and he was many things, Henry II was one of the considerable rulers of England, the founder of a dynasty and the builder of institutions that have lasted to our own day. The energy of Henry II was the wonder and the despair of all who knew him, for the man simply could not be still, and his restlessness turned into legendary. He was forever on the move, crisscrossing his vast dominions on both sides of the Channel at a furious pace, appearing suddenly where he was least expected, wearing out his household and his horses with the speed and the unpredictability of his travels. Those who served him complained that he kept no fixed times, that he would structure a day's journey and then change his mind, that his household was dragged hither and thither at his whim, that he stood for hours and rode for days and seemed never to tire. He dressed plainly, careless of finery, his hands rough and his manner blunt, more like a huntsman than a king to look at, and he had the Angevin temper in full measure, the terrible rages in which, by one famous account, he would throw himself to the ground and gnaw the rushes on the floor. But beneath the restlessness and the rough exterior was one of the ablest minds ever to wear the English crown, and Henry turned that mind above all to the law and the government of his realm. He found a kingdom recovering from anarchy, its administration decayed, its justice in disorder, and he set himself to rebuild and reform it with a thoroughness that left a permanent mark. He sent his judges out on regular circuits through the shires, carrying the royal justice to every part of the realm, and he developed new and fairer procedures, including the use of juries of local men to settle questions of right, an innovation that grew, in time, into one of the foundations of English law. Under Henry, the reach of the courts was extended and regularized as never before, and the beginnings of the common law, the law common to the whole realm, and administered in the sovereign's surname, took shape. It is a remarkable thing that a ruler so warlike and so restless should be remembered, in the end, as much for his courts as for his conquests. But Henry II was that rare thing, a fine soldier who was also a famous lawgiver, and the institutions he built outlasted his empire by many centuries. Behind the wars and the lawmaking lay the unglamorous but vital business of money, for a king could do nothing without it, and the raising and managing of royal revenue was one of the central labours of government. The Plantagenet kings drew their income from many sources, from the lands of the crown, from the profits of justice, from feudal dues owed by their tenants, from the customs on trade, and, increasingly and most controversially, from taxes granted by the realm. And the machinery for gathering and accounting for all this was among the most advanced in Europe. At the heart of it sat the Exchequer, the great financial department of the Crown, where twice a year the Crown's officers reckoned the accounts of the sheriffs and other officials, using a checkered cloth like a notable counting board to do their sums. A system already old and sophisticated by the time the house came to the throne. The eternal problem of the dynasty's monarchs was that their ambitions, above all their wars, cost far more than their ordinary revenues could supply, and so they were driven again and again to seek extraordinary taxation. And it was the need to gain consent for such taxation that did more than anything to build up the power of Parliament. A king who wished to tax his subjects heavily, especially to pay for war, found that he could not simply command it. He had to ask, to summon the representatives of the realm and persuade them to grant it, and in exchange, they pressed their own grievances and demands. So the chronic money hunger of these warlike and ambitious sovereigns, far from making them absolute, did the opposite, for it forced them to bargain with their subjects, to summon parliaments, and seek consent. And in that bargaining, the foundations of representative government were slowly laid. It is one of the mighty ironies of the age that the very wars and extravagances that the sovereigns pursued to exalt their power ended by binding that dominion, through the need for money ever more closely to the consent of the realm. And his power did not rest on England alone, for Henry ruled an empire that stretched down half of what we now call France, a vast assemblage of lands that historians have called the Angevin Empire, and the keystone of it was his marriage. For Henry had married, while still young, one of the most remarkable women of the entire Middle Ages, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and through her he gained the vast Duchy of Aquitaine in the south of France, a domain as large and rich as a realm. Eleanor was a woman of formidable character and high romance, a prosperous heiress who had first been Queen of France, and then, that marriage being dissolved, had married the young Henry and brought her vast inheritance to him. Together they held an empire that ran from the border of Scotland in the north, down through England, across the sea to Normandy and Anjou, and on south, through the rich Duchy of Aquitaine, to the very foot of the Pyrenees on the edge of Spain. It was one of the mightiest dominions in Europe, far larger than the lands of the monarch of France, whom Henry nominally served for his continental possessions, and it made the Angevins, from the very first, a power on the European stage, and not merely an island crown. The marriage of Henry and Eleanor was the foundation of Plantagenet greatness, and it was also, in time, the source of bitter trouble, for these were two strong and proud folk, and their union, fruitful and grand as it was, would end in estrangement and war within their own family. Eleanor of Aquitaine deserves to be known in her own right, for she was one of the most extraordinary women of the entire Middle Ages, and her life was a romance in itself before ever she married Henry. She was born the heiress to the great Duchy of Aquitaine, the opulent and sophisticated land of the troubadours in the south of France, and she inherited it young, becoming one of the greatest prizes in Europe. She was first married, as a girl, to the sovereign of France, and became queen of that land, and she even went with her first husband on crusade to the Holy Land, a remarkable adventure for a queen, surrounded by stories and scandal that have followed her ever since. But that first marriage was not a success. She and the pious French king were ill-suited. She bore him only daughters, and in time the marriage was dissolved on the grounds of kinship, leaving Eleanor free and still in possession of her vast duchy. She did not stay free for long, for within a short time she married the young Henry, then on the brink of the English throne, a man some years her junior, and brought her vast inheritance to him, and so was made the foundation of the Angevin Empire. As Henry's queen, she bore him a large family of sons and daughters, and shared in the splendour of his power, a formidable partner to a formidable monarch. But Eleanor was no meek consort. She was proud, strong-willed, and politically able, and when Henry's relations with his sons broke down, she took the side of her sons against her husband, and for that Henry kept her shut up in confinement for many years, a queen imprisoned by her own king. She outlived him by a long way, and in her old age, freed at last, she was a mite in the land again, defending the inheritance of her son Richard, and ruling in his absence, a grand old matriarch of the dynasty. Few women of any age have lived so full and so dramatic a life, queen of two kingdoms, crusader, prisoner, and the ancestress, through her many children, of much of the royalty of Europe. The Plantagenet centuries were a major age of learning as well as of war, and it was in this period that the institutions of higher study took shape in England that have lasted to our own day, the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. Learning in the Middle Ages was overwhelmingly the preserve of the Church, for it was the Church that needed educated men, clerks who could read and write the Latin of scholarship and administration, and it was from the schools attached to the Church that the universities grew, gatherings of masters and students devoted to the study of the learning of the age. Oxford rose first, becoming by the Plantagenet period a true university, a community of scholars studying the arts and theology and law, and from Oxford, by a migration of scholars, came Cambridge, the second of the great English universities, and the two grew throughout the centuries into institutions of European renown. The learning pursued in these places was the learning of the world, rooted in the texts of the ancient authorities and the theology of the Church, and it produced scholars and thinkers whose work was known across Christendom. For the age of medieval learning was an international one, conducted in the humble Latin tongue and ranging through the universities of Europe. The Plantagenet kings were patrons and sometimes founders of learning, and their age saw the slow growth of literacy and scholarship, the copying and study of books in the monasteries and the universities, the training of the clerks who ran the increasingly sophisticated government of the realm. From these medieval beginnings, the universities founded in the Plantagenet age grew into some of the most famous seats of learning in the world, an enduring legacy of the dynasty's centuries. The homes of study and scholarship that have shaped the intellectual life of the country ever since. Amid all the war and the dynastic violence, the quiet work of learning went on, and it too was part of what the age bequeathed to those who came after. The queens of the Plantagenet age were often figures of great consequence, and a thread of remarkable women runs through the whole dynasty, shaping its fortunes for good and ill. A medieval queen was, in the ordinary way, expected to be a consort and a mother, to bear the monarch heirs, to intercede with her husband on behalf of suppliants, to grace the court and embody its dignity, and to bring, through her marriage, alliance and sometimes rich inheritance to the crown. But the strongest of them were far more than ornaments, and the Plantagenet line threw up some of the most formidable queens in English history, women who ruled in their husbands' absence, led factions, raised armies, and changed the course of events. Eleanor of Aquitaine was the greatest of them, queen of two kingdoms, who brought an empire as her inheritance and outlived her husband to dominate the reigns of her sons. But she was not alone. Isabella of France, the wife of Edward II, rose against her own husband, overthrew him, and ruled for a time in her son's name, earning from later ages a fearsome reputation. Margaret of Anjou, the wife of the saintly and helpless Henry VI, took up the leadership of the Lancastrian cause when her husband could not, and fought for her son's inheritance through the long agony of the Wars of the Roses, with a ferocity that made her one of the central figures of that struggle. These were not women content to sit quietly at their husbands' sides. They were players in the notable game of power, and the history of the Plantagenets cannot be told without them. The dynasty's tale is studded with queens who shaped it, a reminder that even in an age that gave women little formal dominion, the strongest of them found ways to wield a good deal. But before that family turned upon itself, Henry's reign was marked by another and more famous quarrel, the bitter struggle between the sovereign and his archbishop that has echoed down the centuries. The conflict between Henry II and Thomas Becket. Becket had been Henry's friend and his chancellor, a brilliant and worldly servant of the crown, and Henry, wishing to bring the powerful English church more firmly under royal control, had him made Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting a loyal ally in the highest seat of the church. But Becket, raised to that high office, underwent a change, and became instead the fierce and uncompromising defender of the rights of the church against the monarch, and the old friends came to be bitter enemies. Their quarrel dragged on for years, over the question of whether the ruler or the church should hold authority over churchmen, a struggle of wills between two proud and stubborn men, until it reached its terrible climax. For in a fit of rage, Henry let fall words that his knights took as a command, words to the effect that he wished to be rid of this troublesome priest, and 4 of them rode to Canterbury and cut the archbishop down in his own cathedral, killing him before the altar. The murder of Becket shocked all of Christendom, and Henry, horrified at what his words had unleashed, did public penance for it, walking barefoot and submitting to be scourged at the martyr's tomb. Becket became a saint. His shrine, the greatest in England, and the sovereign for all his power, was made to bow before the outrage that his temper had caused. The quarrel between Henry and Becket had at its heart a serious question, one that troubled all of medieval Europe. The question of where the command of the monarch ended and the authority of the church began. The church in that age was a vast might in its own right, with its own courts, its own law, and its own right to stand above the authority of mere earthly rulers in spiritual matters. And the boundary between the two powers was disputed and uncertain. Henry, intent on extending royal sway over every part of his realm, wished to bring churchmen who committed crimes under the jurisdiction of this prince's courts, rather than leaving them to the gentler the law of the church. And he drew up a set of articles, the constitutions of Clarendon, to define the customs of the realm in the crown's favour. Becket, who had at first seemed ready to agree, drew back and resisted, and the two were locked in a struggle that neither would yield, a contest over principle sharpened by the wounded friendship and the clashing pride of two strong men. After the murder, the cult of the martyred archbishop grew with astonishing speed, and Canterbury proved the greatest place of pilgrimage in England and one of the greatest in all Europe. Becket was swiftly declared a saint. Miracles were reported at his tomb, and pilgrims flocked from every corner of the land and beyond to seek healing and grace at the shrine of the holy martyr, leaving offerings that made Canterbury wealthy. The pilgrimage to Canterbury became one of the mighty institutions of English life, woven into the culture of the realm for centuries, the road to the martyr's shrine trodden by people of every rank. And Henry himself, for all his power, was forced to make a humiliating public submission, coming to Canterbury as a penitent, walking the last stretch barefoot, and kneeling at the tomb to be scourged by the monks. An extraordinary spectacle of a mighty king abasing himself before the memory of the man his words had killed. The whole affair showed the limits even of so powerful a ruler as Henry, for against the moral authority of the church, armed with the weapon of a martyr, even he was forced to bend. To understand the quarrels between the Plantagenet kings and the church, and the place of a man like Becket, we must remember how vast a might the church was in that age, a power that touched every life and rivaled the crown itself. The church was not merely a matter of private faith. It was a great institution that owned a large part of the land of the kingdom, that ran its own courts and its own law, that educated such men as were educated, that cared for the sick and the poor, and that retained the keys, in the belief of the time, to salvation or damnation in the life to come. Its bishops were chief lords, its abbeys were rich and powerful, and its head, the Pope in distant Rome, claimed a command that overrode even that of monarchs in matters touching the faith and the church. This immense dominion inevitably brought the church into conflict with princes who wished to rule every part of their realms, and the boundary between the authority of the crown and the power of the church was contested throughout the Plantagenet age. Sovereigns wished to control the appointment of bishops, to tax the wealth of the church, to bring criminous clerks under princely the courts. The church resisted, defending its independence and its privileges, and the result was a recurring struggle that flared sometimes into open conflict, as it did between Henry and Becket, and between John and the Pope, who laid England under an interdict. And running through it all was the deep and genuine piety of the age, for these same kings who quarrelled with the church were also its devoted sons, who founded monasteries, went on crusade, venerated the saints, and feared for their souls. So that the relation of crown and church was not simple enmity, but a complex entanglement of rivalry and reverence, conflict and devotion that shaped the whole of life. The deepest sorrow of Henry's life, though, came not from the church, but from his own sons. For the great brood of children that Eleanor bore him grew up to turn against their father, and the last decades of his reign were consumed by the rebellions of his own brood. Henry and Eleanor had several sons who lived to manhood, and they were able and ambitious young men, impatient for power and lands of their own, and their father, for all his greatness, would not loosen his grip while he lived. Encouraged at times by their mother Eleanor, who became estranged from Henry and whom he kept for years in confinement, and always by the ruler of France, who was glad to stir up trouble within the Angevin house. The sons rose against their father again and again. The revolt of the sons tore the family and the empire, and though Henry, a formidable warrior and statesman to the last, put down each rising, the wars never truly ended, for there was always another grievance, another son in arms. It was a bitter and an exhausting tragedy. The strong old king, worn down by the treachery of the children he had raised, and it broke him at the end. He died, by the accounts that have come down to us, a defeated and a heartbroken man, betrayed even by the son he had loved best, the once mighty founder of the dynasty, brought low by his own blood. The sons who broke Henry's heart were a remarkable and a quarrelsome brood, and their rivalries among themselves and against their father filled the last years of the reign with strife. The eldest surviving son, often called the young king, was actually crowned in his father's lifetime to secure the succession, but given no real authority to match the title, and his frustration made him a focus of rebellion until his early death. Richard, the next, a magnificent soldier, ruled his mother's Aquitaine and fought both for and against his father as the quarrels shifted. Geoffrey, another son, was as treacherous as any, and the youngest, John, the father's favourite in the end, would prove the most faithless of all. These were proud, able, impatient young men, each wanting lands and power of his own, and their father, jealous of his sway and unwilling to divide his empire while he lived, gave them titles without substance and held the real power tight in his own hands, a recipe for endless resentment. What made these rebellions so intractable was that they sprang from a flaw Henry would never mend, his refusal to grant his grown sons any real power to match their titles, so that each young man, given the name of a ruler, but not the substance, was left with every reason to revolt and little to hold him loyal. The King of France understood this perfectly and played upon it without cease, offering the sons a refuge and a backer whenever their resentment boiled over, so that no sooner had Henry mastered one rising than the makings of the next were already in place. The bitterest stroke was kept for the very end. As he lay dying, defeated and forced to terms, Henry asked to be told the names of those who had conspired against him in the final revolt, and found at the head of the list the name of John, the youngest and best loved of his sons, the one he had trusted above all the rest. It is said that he turned his face to the wall and gave up the struggle, the great founder of the dynasty, undone not by any foreign enemy, but by the children of his own body. The son who succeeded him was the most famous of all the dynasty, the warrior king Richard I, whom his own age and every age since has called Richard the Lionheart. Richard was everything a king was supposed to be. In the eyes of his contemporaries, a magnificent soldier, brave to the point of recklessness, a brilliant commander, tall and strong and golden, the very image of the chivalric warrior. He came to the throne with one purpose burning in him, to go on crusade to the Holy Land and win back Jerusalem from the great Muslim leader Saladin. And almost as soon as he was crowned, he set off, leaving England in the hands of others and pouring its prosperity into his crusade. In the Holy Land, Richard won wide fame, fighting Saladin to a standstill, and earning the respect even of his enemies, though he did not in the end take Jerusalem, and his deeds there made him a legend across Europe. But his crusading and his wars cost England dearly, in money above all, for the country was taxed heavily to pay for his campaigns, and later for the enormous ransom that had to be raised when Richard, returning home, was captured and held prisoner by an enemy in Germany. The truth is that Richard the Lionheart, for all his glory, was scarcely an English king at all in any homely sense. He spent almost none of his reign in England, did not trouble to learn its language, and saw it chiefly as a source of money and men for his wars abroad. He died as he had lived in battle, struck by a crossbow bolt at the siege of a minor castle in France. The great crusader brought down in an obscure quarrel, and the crown passed to the least worthy of all the brothers. It was not only in Britain that the Angevin rulers extended their power, for it was the first of them, Henry II, who first brought English rule to Ireland, beginning an involvement that would prove lengthy and troubled. Norman and English lords, adventurers seeking lands and fortune, had crossed to Ireland and carved out territories for themselves. And Henry, wary of these freebooting subjects building up dominion beyond his control, came himself to Ireland with an army and asserted his lordship over the island and over the Norman lords and the Irish monarchs alike. From that time, the monarchs of England kept the title of Lord of Ireland, and a portion of the island, especially around the coast and the area about Dublin, came under English control and English law, while much of the rest remained under the old Irish lords and their ancient ways. The Plantagenet kings ruled an island realm and lands over the sea, and so the sea itself was always of consequence to them. The highway and the barrier between England and the continent, and the keeping of the channel was a matter of constant concern. England had no standing navy in the modern sense, through most of the age, but the Crown could call upon the ships of the ports, above all the group of southeastern harbours known as the Cinque Ports, which, in return for their privileges, were bound to furnish ships and men for the royal service, providing the nearest thing the realm had to a fleet. In time of war, the Crown would also requisition merchant ships, turning the trading vessels of his subjects to the carrying of armies and the fighting of battles at sea. And the expeditions to France depended utterly on the gathering of such ships to ferry the men and horses across the water. Control of the sea mattered greatly to the wars of the age, for an army bound for France had to cross the Channel, and a hostile fleet might fall upon the crossing or raid the English coast. And there were battles fought upon the water as well as the land. The English coast was vulnerable to the raids of enemies, and the south in particular suffered when the war went badly and French ships harried the ports and burned the coastal towns. The keeping of the narrow seas, the safe passage of armies and trade, the defence of the coast against raids were thus a recurring care of the Plantagenet crown, an island power with continental ambitions that depended on the sea for both. It is worth remembering, amid the battles on land, this maritime dimension of the age, the ships of the ports, and the requisitioned merchantmen carrying the monarch's wars down the water, the channel that was at once the road to France and the moat that guarded England, the sea power on which so much of the dynasty's continental adventure ultimately rested. The English hold on Ireland was always partial and often precarious, a matter of a controlled region and a shifting frontier rather than a complete subjugation, and across the Plantagenet centuries the degree of English control waxed and waned, never extending firmly over the whole island. It was the beginning of a long and a difficult entanglement, the planting of English power in Ireland that would shape the history of both islands for centuries to come, with consequences that ran far beyond the Plantagenet age. For our story, it is enough to mark that the involvement began with Henry II, that the lordship of Ireland was added to the titles of the English crown, and that these sovereigns ruled, in surname at least, over a dominion that included not only England and their French lands, and in time Wales, but also a foothold in Ireland, the various pieces of a composite monarchy held together by the person of the sovereign. The Plantagenets were, throughout their age, rulers of more than England alone, and their ambitions reached throughout the seas around them, into Ireland and Scotland and France, with results that were rarely simple and never wholly secure. Richard's crusade, the vast enterprise of his life, was the third of the crusades that the Christian West launched to recover the holy places, and it pitted him against one of the most admired figures of the age, the Muslim leader Saladin, who had retaken Jerusalem. Richard threw himself into the venture with all his formidable energy and skill, and in the Holy Land he proved himself the finest soldier of his generation, winning battles, taking the port of Acre, and pressing toward Jerusalem itself. He and Saladin became, across the lines of their war, a kind of legend to each other. Two mighty commanders, each respecting the other's courage and honour, and the stories of their chivalrous dealings, true or embellished, turned into part of the romance of the age. But for all his victories, Richard could not in the end take Jerusalem, the prize being too well defended and his own position too precarious. And he had to content himself with a treaty that allowed Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City, and turned for home. The journey home brought disaster for Richard. Shipwrecked and travelling in disguise through the lands of his enemies, was recognised and seized by a hostile duke and handed over to the emperor, who retained the sovereign of England prisoner and demanded an enormous ransom for his release. The raising of that ransom, a colossal sum, fell upon England, which was squeezed and taxed to its limits to buy back its absent king. A heavy price for a sovereign who had spent almost no time in the realm and showed little interest in it beyond what it could yield him in money and men. When Richard was finally freed and returned, it was not to settle down to the government of England, but to fling himself into war again, this time against the French crown, defending his continental lands. And it was in one of these obscure French campaigns that he met his end, struck by a crossbow bolt at the siege of a small castle and dying of the wound. The Lionheart, the greatest warrior of his succession, the hero of Christendom, died not gloriously at Jerusalem, but in a petty quarrel over a minor stronghold, leaving no child to follow him. And the crown passed to the brother who had plotted against him while he was away. The crusade that consumed Richard the Lionheart was only one episode in the great movement that drew the warriors of the Christian West to the Holy Land through these centuries. And the spirit of the crusade ran deep in the Plantagenet age. To take the cross, to vow to go and fight for the recovery of the holy places where Christ had lived and died, was held to be the noblest enterprise a Christian knight could undertake. An act of devotion that promised the forgiveness of sins and a place in heaven, as well as adventure, glory, and the chance of plunder and land in the east. Men of every rank took the cross, from rulers down to common soldiers, leaving their homes and mortgaging their lands to pay for the prolonged and perilous journey to the east. And the ideal of the crusade was woven deep into the chivalry and the piety of the age. For the dynasty's rulers, the crusade had a special pull, and more than one of them took the cross or dreamed of doing so. Richard the Lionheart made it the grand enterprise of his life. Pouring the wealth of England into his expedition and winning undying fame in the Holy Land, his major nephew Edward, the future Edward I, went on crusade as a young prince, and the ideal haunted others who never went. The Crusades brought the men of England and the West into contact with the older and in many ways more sophisticated civilizations of the East, with new goods and ideas and ways of war, and they shaped the imagination of the age, filling it with tales of distant lands and holy wars and chivalrous deeds against the infidel. They were also, seen with a colder eye, wars of subjugation and bloodshed that achieved little lasting and cost a good deal. But to the population of the time, they were the highest of all enterprises, and the crusading ideal was part of the air the Plantagenets breathed. For Richard left no son, and the throne passed to his younger brother John, who has come down through history as one of the worst sovereigns England ever had, a byword for tyranny and failure. John was clever enough, and not without ability, but he was suspicious, cruel, treacherous, and unlucky, a man who inspired no loyalty and broke faith with everyone. And under him, the considerable Angevin Empire that Henry II had built came crashing down. The disaster of his reign was the loss of Normandy, the ancestral duchy across the Channel from which the whole Norman an Angevin enterprise in England had sprung. For John, outmaneuvered and outfought by the sovereign of France, lost Normandy and most of the other continental lands, so that the empire that had stretched to the Pyrenees was reduced in a few years to England and a remnant in the south of France. It was a catastrophe, the throwing away of the inheritance of his fathers, and it earned John the bitter contempt of his barons, who had lost their own lands in France along with the crowns. Defeated abroad and grasping at home, taxing and extorting to pay for his failed wars, quarrelling even with the church, until the Pope laid all England under an interdict, John drove his kingdom toward open revolt, until at last the barons rose against him in arms and forced upon him the most famous document in English history. The loss of Normandy, the central catastrophe of John's reign, was a disaster whose meaning is hard to overstate, for Normandy was the cradle of the whole Norman and Angevin enterprise in England. The duchy from which William the Conqueror had come, and to which the English ruling class still felt itself bound. John lost it through a combination of bad luck, bad faith, and bad generalship, outmaneuvered by the cool and capable King of France, who seized on John's missteps to declare his French lands forfeit, and then made the declaration good by force of arms. There was a dark episode at the heart of it, the fate of John's young nephew Arthur, who had a claim to the throne and fell into John's hands and was never seen again. Almost certainly murdered on John's orders, a crime that turned many of his French vassals against him in horror. One by one, the great fortresses of Normandy fell, and with them the duchy, and then Anjou itself, the family's ancestral home, and most of the rest of the continental empire, until the vast Angevin dominion was reduced to England and a portion of the south of France. For the barons of England, this was a personal as well as a national disaster, for many of them kept lands on both sides of the Channel, and the loss of Normandy meant the loss of their French estates, a grievance they laid squarely at the monarch's door. And John, having lost the empire, spent the rest of his reign in a grinding effort to raise the money and men to win it back, taxing and extorting and squeezing his subjects with a ruthlessness that turned the whole political nation against him. He quarrelled with the church as well over the appointment of an archbishop until the Pope laid all England under an interdict, suspending the services of the church, and then excommunicated the prince himself, so that John ruled for decades as a sovereign cut off from the church, his subjects deprived of its rights. Defeated abroad, hated at home, faithless, grasping, and cruel, John drove his realm step by step toward the explosion of baronial anger that would produce in the meadow at Runnymede the great charter that has outlived all his failures. The Plantagenet monarchs had no single fixed capital from which they ruled, but governed instead from wherever they happened to be, for the entourage travelled with the ruler. A vast moving household that followed him about his dominions in an endless progress. To rule, a medieval sovereign had to be seen, to show himself in the different parts of his realm, to hear suits and dispense justice and receive his subjects in person, and so the monarch was forever on the move, and his whole household moved with him. A small travelling town of servants and officials and guards and hangers-on, with all its baggage and its horses and its carts. The arrival of the sovereign and his court was a momentous event, and a heavy burden for the place that received it, for the household had to be fed and lodged, and the country round about might be stripped to supply it. So that the coming of the prince was a mixed blessing for those on whom it descended. This itinerant the crown, the household forever on the road, was the normal way of ruling in the earlier Plantagenet age, and it shaped the life of the throne, for the sovereign carried his government with him in his household. The clerks and the records and the treasure travelling with the court, the business of the realm conducted wherever the ruler happened to be. Over time, the machinery of government grew too large and too complex to travel everywhere with the monarch, and parts of it settled in fixed places, above all at Westminster, which grew into the administrative heart of the kingdom, the home of the exchequer and the courts of law, even as the crown himself continued to move about. But the older pattern of the travelling entourage, the monarch progressing through his realm with his household about him, remained part of the life of the monarchy throughout the age, and it is worth picturing. This vast moving household winding along the poor roads of England, carrying the throne and his government from castle to castle and town to town over the protracted decades of the dynasty's rule. That document was Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Sealed by King John at a meadow called Runnymede beside the Thames in the year 1215 under the swords of his rebellious barons. In its origins, it was no grand declaration of universal liberty, but a hard, practical settlement forced on a hated monarch by the lords he had wronged, a list of their grievances and a set of limits on what the ruler might do, protecting their rights and their property against his abuses. And yet, in setting down the principle that even the crown was bound by law, that there were things he could not lawfully do, that the rights of his subjects must be respected, Magna Carta planted a seed that would grow far beyond anything its makers intended. It became, in the long unrolling of the centuries, one of the foundation stones of English liberty and of the rule of law, invoked again and again by later ages against the overreach of kings. A charter whose few surviving clauses are honoured still. John himself had no intention of keeping it, and sought at once to have it annulled, plunging the nation back into civil war. But he died soon after, in the midst of that war, leaving the throne to a child, and the charter survived him. It is a strange irony that the worst of the Plantagenet sovereigns should have given his name, however unwillingly, to the most celebrated guarantee of freedom in the English tradition. The scene at Runnymede, the meadow beside the Thames where the charter was sealed, has become one of the iconic moments of English history, the sovereign brought to terms by his barons in the open field. It was no peaceful negotiation, but a settlement forced on a beaten and a cornered king, for the barons had risen in arms, taken London, and reduced John to a position where he had no choice but to come to the meadow and set his seal to their demands. The charter that resulted was a long and detailed document, much of it concerned with the specific grievances of the barons, the abuses of John's rule that they wished to end, the feudal exactions, the arbitrary fines, the seizures of property, the misuse of the royal power over the law and money. It was a practical settlement of real complaints, not a philosophical declaration, and most of its clauses dealt with matters that have long since ceased to matter to anyone. The barons who forced Magna Carta upon King John, and who rose and fell in so many of the crises of the age, were the notable lords of the realm, and to understand them, we must understand the structure of the society over which the house ruled. It was a society built, in theory, upon a chain of land and loyalty, in which the crown granted mighty estates to his chief men, the barons, in return for their service and above all their service in war. And they in turn granted lands to lesser men in return for service, and so on down the scale, so that the holding of land was bound up with the owing of loyalty and military service in a great hierarchy. The barons at the top of this structure, holding their vast estates directly from the sovereign, were mighty men, with their own castles, their own armed followers, their own courts, and they were this prince's natural partners in the government of the realm, and also his most dangerous potential opponents. The whole political history of the Plantagenet age can be seen as a long negotiation, often violent, between the crown and these powerful men, over how the realm should be governed and how the sovereign's power should be limited. A strong king could master his barons, bend them to his will, lead them in war and bind them with reward. A weak or a foolish king might be defied, coerced, even deposed by them. The major crises of the age, Magna Carta, the wars of Simon de Montfort, the deposing of Edward II and Richard II, the Wars of the Roses, were all in their different ways struggles between the crown and the nobility over the control of the realm. The barons were not, for the most part, seeking to overthrow the crown. They wished rather to control it, to have their due share in the governing of the realm, to be ruled according to law and custom rather than the mere will of the monarch. The lasting tension between this proud and powerful nobility and the ambitions of the crown is one of the central themes of the whole Plantagenet story. And yet, scattered through that practical document, were principles that would prove to have a life far beyond the quarrel that produced them, and it is for these that Magna Carta is remembered. There was the principle that the crown could not levy certain taxes without the ordinary consent of the realm, a seed from which in time the dominion of Parliament would grow. There was the famous guarantee that no free man should be imprisoned or stripped of his rights or outlawed or exiled, save by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land, a promise that grew across the centuries into the cherished idea of due process and trial by jury, the protection of the subject against the arbitrary power of the state. Above all, there was the underlying principle, revolutionary in its quiet way, that the sovereign himself was beneath the law, bound by it, not free to do simply as he willed, and that his subjects had rights he was obliged to respect. John never meant to keep the charter, and had it annulled by the Pope almost at once, plunging the country into renewed war. But he died soon after, and those who governed for his young son reissued the charter, and so it survived, to be invoked and reissued and appealed to down the lengthy centuries as the foundation of English liberty under law. The child who succeeded John was his young son, who came to be Henry III, a boy of 9 when he came to the throne, and his reign was one of the longest in all English history, stretching over more than half a century. The early years were a minority, the kingdom governed in the boy's name by able men who saved the throne for him, drove out the French prince whom the rebel barons had invited in, and restored order after the wreck of John's reign. When Henry grew to rule in his own right, he proved a very different king from his fierce forefathers, a man of peace rather than war, devout and cultured, more interested in art and architecture and the splendours of piety than in conquest or government. His considerable monument is Westminster Abbey, which he rebuilt in the soaring new Gothic style as a shrine fit for a saint king and a setting for the English crown, one of the most beautiful churches in the world and the coronation place of English monarchs ever since. But Henry was not a strong or a skillful ruler of men. He was extravagant. He favoured foreign relations and friends who were resented, and he handled his barons poorly, and his prolonged reign, peaceful in its aims, was troubled by the same baronial discontent that had dogged his father. Out of that discontent came one of the most important developments in the whole Plantagenet age, and one of the most remarkable men of the century, to whom we now turn. The minority of Henry III, the decades when he was too young to rule, were a dangerous time that might easily have seen the loss of the throne. For John had died in the middle of a civil war with a French prince, actually invited into England by the rebel barons and holding much of the land. That the throne was saved for the boy was the work of a few loyal and able men, chief among them the great old knight, William Marshal, who governed as regent, rallied the loyalists, drove out the French prince, and reissued Magna Carta to win back the waverers, steering the realm through its peril and handing it over, restored to system, when the boy grew toward manhood. It was a remarkable rescue, and it speaks to the strength that the institutions of English government had already reached, that the realm could survive the death of a hated monarch in the midst of war and the succession of a child, and come through intact. The upbringing of a royal heir apparent was a matter of the gravest importance, for on the son who would one day be king rested the future of the dynasty and the peace of the realm. And the training of the heir to the throne was undertaken with notable care. A king's son destined for the crown was raised to the arts a ruler would need, taught to ride and to bear arms and to lead in war. For a king was above all expected to be a warrior, and schooled also, in some measure, in letters and in the business of rule, surrounded by tutors and companions chosen to fit him for his future. The young prince was often given lands and a household of his own as he grew, and brought into the business of government, learning the craft of kingship at his father's side or in the management of his own estates. Prepared step by step for the high office that awaited him. The title that came in time to mark the next king to the English throne was Prince of Wales, conferred by Edward I and his successors upon the sovereign's eldest son. A title taken from the native princes whose independence Edward had destroyed, and borne ever since by the heir apparent. To be the monarch's eldest son, the successor, was to occupy a position of mighty expectation and sometimes of grave danger, for the relations between rulers and their heirs were not always easy, as the bitter wars between Henry II and his sons had shown, the impatience of the heir apparent for authority clashing with the royal reluctance to share it, and the heir was always vulnerable for the early death of a young prince, as in the case of the Black Prince, who died before his father, could throw the succession into doubt and the dynasty into danger. The smooth passing of the crown from father to son was the ideal that secured the peace of the realm, and the careful raising of the next king was meant to ensure it. But the ideal was often broken by early death, by disputed right, by the clash of king and heir, and from those breakages flowed much of the strife of the Plantagenet age. The courts that the Angevin rulers administered, and which did so much to bind the realm together, deserves a closer look. For the growth of royal justice was one of the great achievements of the age, and touched the lives of ordinary people, as the wars and the dynastic struggles did not. Before the reforms of Henry II and his successors, the law had been a local and a various thing, administered in the courts of lords and communities by old customs that differed from place to place, and including such methods as the trial by ordeal, in which the guilt or innocence of an accused was supposedly revealed by whether he was harmed by fire or water, a judgment left to God. The Plantagenet kings extended the reach of the ruler's own, the courts down the realm, sending royal judges on regular circuits through the shires to hear cases in the crown's title, and developing new and more rational procedures to replace the old ordeals. Among the most important of these developments was the growth of the jury, the body of local men summoned to give a true answer on the matters in dispute, which grew across the period into the means by which questions of guilt and of right were decided, the ancestor of the juries that decide cases to this day. The replacement of the ordeal and the private judgment of lords by the sovereign's justice, administered by princely judges according to a common law and increasingly through juries, was a slow revolution that brought a more uniform and a more rational the law to the realm, and bound the country together under one law administered in the crown's surname. It was, in the long run, one of the most important things the Angevins did, more lasting than their conquests and more beneficial than their wars. The building of a system of royal courts and common law that reached into every shire and shaped the lives of the crown's subjects, and that grew, throughout the centuries, into one of the major legal traditions of the world. The king, as the fountain of justice, the giver of law and the righter of wrongs, was one of the noblest faces of medieval royal office. And the Plantagenets, for all their faults, did much to make it real. At the heart of Henry's devotion stood the cult of Edward the Confessor, the Saint King of Old England, whom he venerated above all others. And it was to honour that royal saint that he rebuilt Westminster in the new Gothic manner, raising over the Confessor's shrine one of the most beautiful churches in Christendom. He lavished upon it the wealth and the years that a harder king would have poured into war, and in doing so he gave the English monarchy its sacred stage, the place of its crownings and its burials ever after. Yet piety was no substitute for the harder skills of rule, and the very open-handedness that adorned the abbey left the ruler forever short of money, and leaning on the goodwill of subjects, he too often slighted. The long peace of his reign was an uneasy one, and out of the discontent it bred came the crisis that produced the first true parliaments and the remarkable career of Simon de Montfort. The abbey that Henry III raised at Westminster was far more than a church. It became the very stage of the English monarchy, the place where the monarchs of England were crowned, and in time where many were buried, the sacred heart of the monarchy. From Henry's day onward, the coronation of the English sovereign took place at Westminster, in a ceremony of much solemnity and splendour, and the abbey proved the setting for the central rite of the monarchy, the making of a monarch. The coronation itself was an elaborate and a sacred drama, in which the new king was presented to the subjects, swore the royal oaths to govern justly and uphold the church and the law, was consecrated with holy oil in the most consecrated moment of the rite, and was crowned and enthroned and acclaimed, emerging a consecrated king. Around this central rite gathered the regalia, the hallowed objects of monarchy, the crown and the sceptre and the rest, symbols of the office laden with meaning, and the whole apparatus of ceremony by which the abstract idea of kingship was made visible and tangible. The coronation chair, made to hold the captured stone of Scone that Edward I carried off from the Scots, became part of this apparatus, and English sovereigns have been crowned in it ever since. To be crowned at Westminster, anointed and enthroned in the great abbey, was to be set apart in the eyes of the realm and of God. And the abbey that Henry III built in his piety has remained, for many centuries, the sacred theatre of the monarchy, the place where the crown is given and where the bones of the royal dead lie gathered. It is a fitting monument to a prince who cared more for the splendours of religion than for the hard business of rule, that his vast church should have become the enduring shrine of the very throne he served so imperfectly. Just as the coronation made a sovereign, so the death and burial of one was a great occasion of state and of religion, and the tombs of the Plantagenet line are among the most striking monuments they left behind. Such a death was a moment of danger and solemnity, the passing of the anointed and the succession of the heir, marked by elaborate funeral rites in which the dead were honoured and mourned, and the soul commended to God with all the resources of the church. The royal dead of the dynasty were laid to rest in vast churches, many of them in Henry III's abbey at Westminster, which became the chief mausoleum of the monarchy, others in cathedrals and abbeys about the realm, their tombs marked by splendid monuments, effigies of stone or metal showing the figure in the dignity of his office, lying in state forever in his church. These royal tombs were not only memorials, but acts of piety and of dynastic display, for a splendid tomb proclaimed the majesty of the crown and his house. And the prayers said at it, for the sovereign's soul, were thought to ease his passage through the next age, so that princes founded chantries and endowed masses to be said for them in perpetuity. The effigies that lie upon these tombs, the carved images of the rulers and queens of the Plantagenet line, are among the most evocative relics of the age, the faces of the lengthy dead sovereigns gazing up from their monuments across the centuries. The warriors and the lawgivers and the saints and the tyrants of the dynasty gathered in the soaring churches in the sleep of death. Not all of them rest so grandly, for the dynasty's violence reached even into death, and some of its kings, the deposed and the defeated, were buried obscurely or had their resting places lost. None more so than the last of the lineage, whose grave was forgotten for centuries after his fall. But for most of these monarchs and queens, the grand tomb in the mighty church was the final act of a royal life, the royal dead laid to rest in honour, awaiting, in the faith of the age, the resurrection of the dead. That man was Simon de Montfort, a French-born nobleman who became Earl of Leicester and for a brief and extraordinary moment, the effective ruler of England. The barons, exasperated by Henry III's misrule and his favourites, had forced upon him a programme of reform, a set of provisions that placed the sovereign under the control of a council of magnates, and when Henry tried to wriggle free of these limits, the quarrel flared into open civil war. At the head of the reforming barons stood Simon de Montfort, a man of fierce conviction and great ability, and in the war that followed, he did the astonishing thing of defeating and capturing the sovereign himself in battle, becoming for a time the master of the kingdom. And it was during this brief ascendancy that Simon summoned the assembly for which he is chiefly remembered. For in his need to broaden his support, he called a parliament, to which were summoned not only the great lords and churchmen, but also representatives of the counties, and for the first time, of the towns, the burgesses of the boroughs. This gathering has often been seen as a landmark in the protracted growth of the English Parliament, the early appearance of the commons, the ordinary men of property from shire and town, in the councils of the realm. Simon's own rule did not last. The sovereign's son, the future Edward I, escaped, raised an army, and destroyed Simon's forces in a hard-fought battle in which Simon himself was killed. But though the man was defeated, the idea outlived him, for the summoning of knights and burgesses to Parliament, begun in rebellion, was taken up by the very monarchs who had defeated him, and became a permanent and a growing part of English government. The reform movement that Simon came to lead had begun as an attempt by the barons as a whole to impose order on Henry III's misgovernment. And it produced a remarkable programme of reform that went far beyond anything Magna Carta had attempted. The barons forced upon the monarch a set of provisions, drawn up at Oxford, that placed the government of the realm under the supervision of a council of magnates, regularised the holding of parliaments, and sought to reform the abuses of princely administration throughout the country. It was in effect an attempt to subject the sovereign to a form of conciliar control, to make the crown govern with and through the advice of the realm rather than by the prince's mere will, and it went to the very edge of what a medieval realm could countenance. Henry submitted under pressure and then, predictably, sought to free himself from the restraints, appealing to the Pope to release him from his oath, and the broken agreement slid into open war. Simon himself was a figure of unusual depth, fierce in his convictions, austere in his life, and genuinely committed, it seems, to the cause of reform rather than to his own advancement alone, though his enemies never believed it of him. His two great battles fixed both his fame and his fall. At Lewes he triumphed and took the sovereign captive, the high water mark of his power, and at Evesham, hemmed in and outnumbered. He met a soldier's death, his body so shamefully used by the victors that their treatment of it shocked even that hard age. In the years afterward, a popular cult gathered about his memory, and miracles were said to be worked at the place of his death. For many of the common people cherished him as a champion of right against a faithless crown. The man was gone. But what he had set in motion proved more durable than any feat of arms, for the habit of gathering the realm's representatives to treat with their ruler did not die with him. The prince who destroyed Simon de Montfort and saved his father's throne came to be, in time, one of the greatest of all the dynasty's sovereigns. Edward I, a towering figure in every sense. For he was a very tall man, protracted in the leg, who earned the nickname Longshanks. Edward was everything his gentle father had not been, a hard, masterful, formidable king, a soldier and a lawgiver and a ruler of iron will. and under him the English crown reached a new height of power and structure. He was, above all, a considerable maker of laws, and his reign saw a stream of important statutes that reshaped English law and government, earning him a place as one of the founders of the legal system, so that later ages sometimes called him the English Justinian, after the mighty lawgiver of Rome. He brought the barons to heel, reformed the administration of the realm, and made regular use of parliaments, which under him became an established institution of government, summoned to grant taxes and assent to laws. Edward was a ruler who meant to be obeyed within his realm and beyond it, and he turned the new strength of the English crown outward against the other peoples of the island of Britain, in wars of subjugation that would occupy the rest of his reign and leave their mark on the map of these islands forever. Before he came to the throne, Edward had gone on crusade himself, travelling to the Holy Land as a young prince and winning a reputation for courage. And there is a famous story, which we may take or leave, that he was wounded by a poisoned dagger and saved by the devotion of his wife, who was said to have sucked the poison from the wound. That wife was Eleanor of Castile, a Spanish princess, to whom Edward was married young, and to whom, unusually among the sovereigns of that hard age, he was devoted, and her death later in his reign moved him to a famous display of grief. For he had massive stone crosses raised at every place where her funeral procession rested on its way to burial. The Eleanor crosses, monuments of love that marked the road of her last journey. It is a softer side of a hard king, this devotion to his queen, and it is worth remembering alongside the ruthlessness he showed his enemies. As a ruler, Edward was, above all, a lawgiver, and his reign saw a remarkable series of important statutes that reshaped the law and government of England, addressing the holding of land, the administration of the law, the keeping of the peace, the rights of the crown, in a sustained programme of legislation that earned him a lasting place among the makers of English law. He brought order and definition to a legal system still half-formed, and his statutes remained the foundation of whole areas of the law for centuries. But there was a darker side to his rule of his own realm, for it was Edward who, in a notorious act, expelled the entire Jewish population from England, the Jews having been squeezed dry by royal taxation and then cast out altogether, banished from the kingdom in a cruel and a final stroke that would not be reversed for centuries. It was an act of its age, and a grim one, and it sits beside the statutes and the conquests as part of the record of this formidable and unsparing king, who used the full might of the crown for system and for the courts as his age understood them, and also for conquest and for cruelty. For all the splendour of rulers and nobles, the vast mass of the people over whom the dynasty ruled were not lords or knights or merchants, but ordinary country folk, the peasants who worked the land and their lives. Though they fill few pages of the chronicles with the foundation on which the whole edifice rested, the typical peasant of the earlier Plantagenet age was not a free man in the full sense, but a villein bound to the land of his lord's manor, owing labour and dues in return for the holding by which he lived, unable to leave without his lord's leave, subject to the lord's court and the lord's exactions. His life was one of hard and unremitting labour in the fields, governed by the turning of the agricultural year, lived in a small village among his neighbours, close to the edge of want. For a bad harvest could bring hunger, and a series of them could bring famine and death. If the countryside was the home of the vast majority, the towns were the growing points of the age. And through the Plantagenet centuries they swelled in number and in wealth, the seats of trade and craft, and a freer kind of life than the manor allowed. A town was a place apart from the ordinary rural order, often holding a charter from the monarch or a great lord that granted it privileges, the right to hold markets and fairs, to govern itself in some measure, to be free of certain dues, and the air of the town was said to make a man free. For a villain who dwelt in a chartered town for a year and a day might escape the bondage of the manor. The towns were the homes of the merchants and the craftsmen of trade and manufacture, and they grew prosperous on the commerce of the age, above all on the wool and the cloth that were the foundation of English riches. Within the towns, the craftsmen and merchants organized themselves into guilds, associations of those who followed the same trade or craft, which regulated their work, guarded their standards, protected their members, and played a notable part in the affairs and the government of the town. The guilds set the rules of their trades, trained the apprentices, looked after the widows and orphans of their members, and marked the grand occasions of the town with their processions and their feasts, a central institution of urban life. The growth of the towns and the trade and the guilds was one of the quiet but profound developments of the Plantagenet age. The slow rise of a commercial and urban world alongside the older world of lord and peasant. The building of the wealth and the freedoms of the towns that would matter more and more as the centuries passed. Beneath the drama of sovereigns and wars, this growth went steadily on, the towns swelling and prospering. The merchants and craftsmen building the commercial life of the nation, a development as important in its way to the future of the country as any battle or any king. Yet the daily round of the medieval village was not only toil and subjection, for it had its own rhythms and its own community, its festivals and its customs. The lavish feasts of the church that broke the labour of the year. The shared life of the village with its ties of neighbourhood and kin. And the condition of the common folk did not stay fixed across the Plantagenet centuries, for the upheavals of the age, above all the Black Death, transformed it. The dying off of so many making the labour of the survivors valuable and loosening the old bonds of servitude, so that over the later Plantagenet period, the villein slowly gave way to the freer peasant. The old servitude dissolving under the pressure of changed conditions and the risings of the common people. The lives of these ordinary folk, the unnamed millions who worked the land and bore the burdens and occasionally rose in revolt, were the mighty silent background to the drama of monarchs and battles, and they too were part of the Plantagenet age. The broad foundation of laborious common life on which the glittering and violent world of the great was built. The lived experience of that world was shaped, above all, by the slow wheel of the seasons. For the people of the Plantagenet age measured their days not by clocks and calendars as we do, but by the turning of the year and the round of the church's festivals. That round was a great circle of labour and observance, beginning in the dark of winter with the feast of Christmas and its 12 days of rest and merriment in the cold heart of the year. Then passing through the long fast of Lent to the joy of Easter, the chief festival of all, when the returning light of spring and the risen Christ were celebrated together. Through the warm months came the heavy labour of the fields, the haymaking and the harvest, the most anxious and the most vital season of all, on which the very survival of the community hung. And after the corn was gathered, came the autumn thanksgivings and the slow turning once more toward the cold. The bells of the parish church marked the hours of each day, calling the people to prayer and to rest. And the saints' days studded the calendar with their celebrations, breaking the toil with holy days that were also holidays. To live then was to dwell within this turning rhythm, the same procession of seasons and observances that one's parents and grandparents had known, coming round again and again down the generations, slow and certain and deeply comforting in its sameness. It is among the things hardest for us now to recover, this older feeling for time, unhurried and circular, ruled by the sun and the soil and the bells. And yet it was the very texture of daily life for the broad mass of ordinary folk over whom the Plantagenets reigned, the quiet background against which the loud brief dramas of their rulers played themselves out. The first of these conquests was Wales, the mountainous land in the west that had kept its own princes and its own ancient law and language, never yet brought under English rule. The Welsh, under their last major native prince, Llywelyn, had built up a real power in the north and west, and Edward, determined to break it, came against them with the full might of the English crown in a series of hard campaigns. He ground down the Welsh resistance by main force and careful strategy, cutting off the mountain strongholds, until Llywelyn was killed and the independent Principality of Wales was destroyed and annexed to the English crown. And to hold his conquest, Edward did something extraordinary, building a ring of vast stone strongholds around the coast of North Wales, the mightiest fortresses of their age, strongholds whose high walls and towers still stand today as the most magnificent castles in Britain. The iron chain by which the conquered land was held. The title of Prince of Wales, the native princes being gone, was given in time to the heir of the English king, as it has been ever since. The conquest of Wales was a brutal and a thorough piece of work, the extinction of an ancient independence, and it showed the new Plantagenet monarchy at its most powerful and most ruthless. Able to marshal the resources of a kingdom to crush a smaller neighbour and hold the conquest with walls of stone. At Caernarfon and Conwy, at Harlech and Beaumaris, Edward's military architects raised strongholds of a scale and a sophistication never before seen in these islands, with great concentric walls and towers and elaborate gatehouses, sited with deliberate care upon the coast so that they could be supplied and relieved from the sea, even with the whole country in revolt around them. Caernarfon, with its banded stone and its many-sided towers, was built to be a seat of government as much as a fortress, a deliberate statement in stone of the permanence of English rule. The cost of all this was staggering, swallowing sums that strained even the resources of so powerful a crown, and the building dragged on for decades. But the result was a system of fortification that no Welsh rising could hope to overcome, and that endured, grey and enormous against the mountains, as the supreme achievement of the military builders of the age castles were the very bones of medieval power, and the Plantagenet age was the great age of the castle in Britain, when these mighty fortresses dominated the land as instruments of war and rule and lordship. A castle was at once a fortress, a residence, and a symbol, the stronghold from which a lord controlled the nation around it, the secure base from which armed men could ride out to enforce his will, and the visible proclamation of his command. Towering over the landscape in stone. To take a country and hold it, a conqueror built strongholds, as the Normans had done after their conquest, and as Edward I did in Wales. Planting strongholds to overawe the conquered, and to provide secure points that could not easily be taken back. The taking of a castle was one of the hardest tasks in war, for a well-built and well-provisioned fortress, held by a determined garrison, could defy an army for months, and siege warfare was a slow and a grinding business. An attacker might try to storm the walls with ladders and towers, to break them with huge stone-throwing engines, to undermine them by digging beneath the foundations, or simply to starve the defenders out by blockade, and each of these was difficult and costly and uncertain. The defenders, behind their high walls and towers, with their stores of food and water, kept great advantages, and a strong castle was often more effectively reduced by hunger and time than by assault. The notable castles of the Plantagenet age. Above all, the mighty Welsh fortresses of Edward I represented the highest development of this military architecture, designed by skilled engineers to be all but impregnable, and their massive ruins still stand across the land as the most impressive monuments of medieval power. The stone embodiment of an age when he who held the fortresses retained the land. Alongside the castles, Edward set about binding Wales into the English realm by law and administration, dividing the conquered lands into shires on the English model and imposing English government, while leaving some of the native customs in place. And in a stroke of symbolism that has lasted to our own day, the title of Prince of Wales, once borne by the native rulers Edward had destroyed, was in time conferred upon the heir to the English throne, a tradition that continues still, so that the sovereign's eldest son bears the title of the princes whose independence Edward extinguished. The subjugation of Wales was the most complete and lasting of Edward's military achievements, the permanent annexation of a country that had kept its freedom through all the centuries since the coming of the English. And it showed what the Plantagenet throne at its height could do, marshalling the prosperity and manpower of England to overwhelm a smaller neighbour and to hold the conquest with walls of stone that have outlasted the realm that built them. Edward then turned his ambition north, to Scotland, and here he found a harder task and a more lasting enmity. For the wars he began against the Scots would outlast him and embitter the relations of the two kingdoms for generations. Scotland was a kingdom in its own right, and when its royal line failed and the succession fell into dispute, Edward was invited to arbitrate and used the opportunity to assert himself as overlord and to try to bring Scotland, like Wales, under his control. The Scots rose against him, and there began the long and bitter wars of Scottish independence, in which two mighty Scottish leaders won undying fame. First, William Wallace, who raised the humble people of Scotland against English rule and won a famous victory before he was at last captured and put to a savage death. And then Robert the Bruce, who took up the struggle, had himself crowned King of Scots, and carried on the fight. Edward pursued these wars with relentless ferocity, earning the grim title by which he is remembered in this connection, the Hammer of the Scots. And he was on the march northward once again, an old man, now but unbending, when death took him at last. Almost within sight of the Scottish border, he is said to have asked that his bones be carried at the head of his army until the Scots were subdued. So fixed was his hatred of them, but his quarrel passed unfinished to his son. And that son was very far from being the man his father was. The Scottish wars that Edward began were a longer and a bitterer business than the conquest of Wales, for Scotland was a larger and a stronger realm, with a fierce sense of its own identity, and the attempt to subdue it stirred a national resistance that England could not break. When Edward sought to make himself master of Scotland, treating it as a fief and humiliating its population, the Scots rose against him, and there emerged the first of their great champions, William Wallace, a man not of the high nobility but of the lesser gentry, who raised the common people and won a famous victory over an English army at Stirling Bridge. For a time, Wallace was the guardian of a Scotland in arms, but Edward came north in force and defeated him at Falkirk, where the English longbow first showed its terrible might against massed infantry, and in time Wallace was betrayed, captured, and put to a savage death in London as a traitor, his courage making him a martyr and a legend to his subjects. The one trophy Edward did carry home was the ancient stone of Scone, the sacred stone on which the kings of Scots had been enthroned from days beyond memory, which he bore off to Westminster and had built into a great coronation chair, a token that the Scottish monarchy was now subject to the English crown. But the token outlasted the substance, for Scotland was never truly subdued. Under Robert the Bruce the Scots fought on through defeat and hardship, and within a few years of Edward's death, they had thrown off the English grip and secured, by force of arms, the very independence he had spent his last strength trying to deny them. The wars that Edward began in his pride poisoned the dealings of the two kingdoms for generations, a long inheritance of suspicion and bloodshed bequeathed, with so much else, to a son who had neither the will nor the gifts to carry his father's burdens. It is easy, looking back, to see the Plantagenet age as a pageant of sovereigns and battles. But the people of the time lived always close to the edge of hunger, And before the major plague, there came upon them another and a terrible visitation, a famine that killed its hundreds of thousands. In the early part of the 14th century, in the reign of Edward II, the weather turned against the commons of northern Europe, with decades of cold and ceaseless rain that ruined the harvests again and again, rotting the crops in the fields and the seed in the ground, and bringing on a terrible famine that stalked the land for several years. With the harvests failing and the food running short, the people starved, and the chronicles tell of terrible scenes, of the poor dying in the roads, of the price of food soaring beyond reach, of a hunger so desperate that it drove some to dreadful extremities, a catastrophe that carried off a large part of the population before the plague ever came. This, the famine, is a reminder of how fragile the life of the age truly was, how close even a populous and a prosperous land lived to the edge of disaster. For the whole edifice of society rested on the harvest, and a few bad years could bring hunger and death on a vast scale. The folk had little defence against such calamities, no store considerable enough to carry them through decades of failure, no power over the weather on which everything depended, and when the harvests failed, they died. The famine of Edward II's reign, coming before the plague, weakened and frightened the people, and it was followed within a generation by the far greater catastrophe of the Black Death, so that the 14th century, for all the glamour of Crecy and the Garter, was an age of recurring disaster for the ordinary population, of famine and plague and the hard struggle for survival. Behind the splendour of the Plantagenet household lay this harder reality, the precarious life of a people, always near the edge of want, at the mercy of the weather and the harvest and the pestilence, enduring the calamities of the age as best they could beneath the wars and the glory of their rulers. Edward II, who came to the throne on his great father's death, was one of the tragedies of the dynasty. A man who had inherited none of the iron that had made his father so formidable, and whose reign ended in deposition and a dark death. He was not without gifts, but he had no taste for the hard business of war and government, and he gave his heart instead to a series of favourites. Men he raised up and showered with wealth and dominion far beyond their station, to the fury of his barons and his queen. The first of these favourites, a charming and arrogant young man named Piers Gaveston, was so resented by the powerful lords that they seized him and put him to death. And later, the monarch fell under the influence of another grasping family, the Despensers, whose greed and power brought the realm once more to the edge of civil war. And over all hung the humiliation of Scotland, for Edward led a great army north to crush Robert the Bruce and was utterly defeated at the Battle of Bannockburn, a disaster that secured Scottish independence and marked the monarch as a failure in the one arena where a medieval sovereign most needed to succeed. In the end, Edward was destroyed by his own queen, Isabella of France, who, estranged from her husband and allied with a powerful exiled baron, returned to England in arms, overthrew the ruler, and had him deposed in favour of their young son. Edward II was imprisoned, and there, by the common account, he was murdered, done away with in secret. The first English king since the conquest to be deposed and killed by his own subjects. It was a terrible warning of what could befall even a hallowed sovereign who lost the confidence of his subjects, and it cast a long shadow forward into the dynasty's later decades. The favourite who did most to ruin the early years of Edward II's reign was Piers Gaveston, a young man of charm and wit, but of no mighty birth, on whom this prince lavished titles, fortune, and an intimacy that the leading nobles found intolerable. It was not merely that Gaveston was favoured, it was that he was given precedence and authority above the ancient nobility, that he mocked them with insulting nicknames, that he seemed to monopolise the crown and the patronage that the lords felt was theirs by right, and their resentment grew into a determination to be rid of him. Twice he was driven into exile, and twice the sovereign brought him back, until at last a group of the great barons seized him, and after a form of trial, put him to death. An act of baronial violence that opened a wound between the ruler and his nobility that never truly healed. What gave Edward's fall its peculiar horror was its unprecedented nature. For no anointed sovereign of England since the Norman conquest had been so cast down by his own subjects, and the men who did it took pains to clothe the deed in the forms of law. Edward was not simply seized and disposed of, he was compelled, under pressure and the threat of worse, to renounce his crown in favour of his son, so that the overthrow might wear the look of a lawful abdication rather than a naked seizure. The manner of his end in captivity became one of the darkest whispers of the age, spoken of in terms too grim to set down, and whatever the truth of it, the fallen prince did not long outlive his deposing. For a few years the true mastery of the realm lay with the victorious queen and her ally Mortimer, who governed in the name of the boy now raised to be Edward III, until that boy grew old enough to strike them down. The lesson of the whole affair was not lost on those who came after, that the consecrated person of a king, however hedged about with ceremony, was no shield against the loss of obedience among the men who mattered, and the precedent, once set, would in time be followed again. But the son who came to the throne in his father's place restored the glory of the crown in full measure. For Edward III was a monarch after the old Plantagenet pattern, a brilliant and martial monarch whose long reign was remembered as a golden age of chivalry and conquest. He came of age by throwing off the control of his mother and her favourite, took the government firmly into his own hands, and set about restoring the prestige of the monarchy that his father had so damaged. Edward was a magnificent figure, generous, brave, a lover of tournaments and pageantry and the whole cult of knighthood, and he gathered about him a court of splendour and martial glamour. It was he who founded the Order of the Garter, the most famous order of chivalry in the world, binding the sovereign and his greatest knights together in a brotherhood of honour that has lasted to this day. Under Edward III, the English crown was strong. Edward and his nobles united in common enterprise rather than torn by the strife that had marked so many earlier reigns, and that common enterprise was, above all, war. The war against France that would define his reign and trouble England and France for more than 100 years. Edward III began his reign as a boy under the control of his mother Isabella and her lover Mortimer, the very pair who had overthrown his father, and his first act of real kingship was to throw off their tutelage in a bold stroke, seizing Mortimer and putting him to death, and taking the government into his own hands. From that moment he ruled in his own right, and he set himself with much skill to heal the wounds of his father's disastrous reign, to win back the loyalty and the enthusiasm of his nobility, and to restore the prestige of a monarchy that had been brought low. He understood, as his father never had, that a king must lead his nobles rather than fight them, must give them glory and profit and a share in great enterprises, and bind them to the crown by honour and reward. And in this he succeeded brilliantly, turning the fractious nobility of England into a united and a martial aristocracy gathered around a splendid king. Beyond the glamour of the Garter, the true strength of Edward III's kingship lay in the devotion he won from his nobility, whom he bound to himself by shared enterprise and reward and the lure of glory in war rather than by fear, mending in this the great wound his father had left. His queen, Philippa of Hainault, was a beloved consort who bore him many children and was remembered for her gentleness, and the large brood of sons they raised would be both the strength of the dynasty and in the generations to come, the seed of its destruction, for it was the rivalry of the descendants of Edward's many sons that would in time produce the Wars of the Roses. But that lay far ahead. In Edward's own day the line was united and triumphant, and the crown led his nobility into the great adventure of the French War. The chivalry that Edward III celebrated so brilliantly was one of the central ideals of the Plantagenet age, a code of conduct and a way of life for the warrior nobility, blending the arts of war with notions of honour, loyalty, courtesy, and the service of the church and of ladies. The knight was the central figure of this culture, the mounted and armoured warrior who was also, in the ideal, a man of honour, bound by a code, brave in battle, faithful to his lord, generous, courteous, and the defender of the church and the weak, and the whole apparatus of chivalry, its orders and its ceremonies and its ideals, grew up around this figure. It was an ideal often honoured in the breach, for the same knights who praised courtesy and honour could be brutal and treacherous in practice. But the ideal was real and powerful, shaping how the nobility saw themselves and wished to be seen. The great expression of the chivalric culture was the tournament, the mock war in which knights displayed their prowess and their courage before the watching court, jousting with lance and fighting with sword in elaborate festivals of martial display that were at once sport, training, spectacle, and the very theatre of chivalry. The Plantagenet court, above all under Edward III, was steeped in this culture of tournament and pageantry, with its festivals of arms, its heraldry, its orders of knighthood, its cult of honour and prowess, all binding the nobility together in a shared world of values and display centred on the monarch. At its height, this culture drew knights from across Europe to the great tournaments of the English court, where reputations were made and fortunes spent in a single afternoon, and where the restless energies of the warrior class were turned, for a season, into pageant and play. The cult of chivalry served a real purpose, for it bound the violent and powerful warrior class to ideals of loyalty and honour, and to the person of the sovereign, channeling their ferocity into the service of the crown. And it gave the brutal business of war a glamour and a code that softened, a little, its savagery. The court of a Plantagenet king was a place of display and of plenty, and the feasting that marked its mighty occasions was one of the chief ways in which the magnificence of the throne was shown to the world. A lavish feast was a spectacle as much as a meal, with the hall hung with rich cloths and the high table set above the rest. The monarch enthroned in his majesty, the company seated by careful rank, and course after course of elaborate dishes borne in by the servers, to the sound of music and the flourish of ceremony. The food of such a feast was lavish and various, with large roasts of meat and fowl and game. Dishes spiced with the costly spices brought from the distant east, subtleties and confections made to delight the eye, as well as the palate. The whole a display of the wealth and the power that could command such abundance. For the great, food was a mark of status, as well as a necessity, and the tables of the sovereign and the nobility were laden with a plenty that the humble people never saw. The opulent eating their meat and their white bread and their spiced dishes, while the poor lived on their coarse bread and their pottage and what little else they could come by. The contrast between the feasting of the major and the hard fare of the poor was one of the many faces of the gulf that divided medieval society. The abundance of the court set against the want of the village, and a failed harvest that brought hunger to the poor scarcely touched the tables of the rich. The feasts of the Plantagenet court, with their ceremony and their plenty and their display, were part of the theatre of monarchy, the showing forth of royal magnificence, and they belong to the picture of the age alongside the battles and the cathedrals. The splendid and the wasteful abundance of the few set against the laborious scarcity of the many. The Plantagenet age was also the age that gave birth to some of the most enduring legends of English folklore, the tales of outlaws and greenwood adventure that have never lost their hold on the imagination. Above all, the legend of the outlaw of the greenwood who robbed the wealthy to help the poor. These tales grew up in the later medieval centuries and were set in the age of the Plantagenet rulers, with their forests and their forest law, their sheriffs and their barons, and they expressed in the form of romance something of the feelings of the common people about the justice and the injustice of their world. The forests that the rulers reserved for their hunting, protected by a harsh forest law that punished severely any who took the ruler's deer or trespassed on his preserves, were a real grievance. And the outlaw, who defied that law and lived free in the greenwood, righting wrongs and humbling the proud, was a figure of wish and fantasy for a people who knew well the weight of lordship and the hardness of the law. We need not suppose that such legends rested on any single real outlaw, for they grew and changed in the telling down generations, gathering to themselves the hopes and the humour and the resentments of the ordinary folk. But they belong to the Plantagenet age and its world, and they tell us something true about how that world was felt from below by those who had little power and much to endure. The figure of the bold outlaw, defying unjust might and living free beyond the reach of the sheriff and the lord, was a kind of answer in the imagination to the realities of an age ordered for the benefit of the considerable. A dream of the law and freedom set in the greenwood. These legends are part of the legacy of the Plantagenet centuries, as surely as the strongholds and the cathedrals, the imaginative creations of an age, and they have outlasted the dynasty by far. The tales of the greenwood still told when the names of many of the monarchs are forgotten. Even in its folklore, the age has left its mark. The world of the Plantagenets living on in the stories that grew up beneath their rule. For it was in the reign of Edward III that there began the prolonged conflict known to history as the 100 Years' War. The series of wars between England and France that would drag on with truces and renewals for well over a century. Edward laid claim, through his mother, to the crown of France itself, and whether or not he truly expected to win it, the claim gave him a banner under which to fight, and fight he did, leading great armies across the Channel into France and winning victories that rang through Europe. The English won their fame in these years above, all through two pitched battles, where English armies, smaller but better disciplined, and armed with the deadly longbow, destroyed the chivalry of France. At the Battle of Crécy, the English longbowmen cut down the flower of the French knighthood in a single dreadful afternoon, and 10 years later, at the Battle of Poitiers, an English army under Edward's son, the Black Prince, won an even more astonishing victory, capturing the ruler of France himself and carrying him back to London as a prisoner. These triumphs made England, for a time, the most feared military power in Europe, and they made the reputation of the longbow, the weapon of the English common man, the bow that had humbled the mounted nobility of France. For a generation, the war went well, and England rode high on glory and plunder and ransom. But the tide of war would turn, as it always does, and the lengthy conflict would in the end bring England as much grief as glory. The roots of the lengthy war with France were tangled, part dynastic right and part the old friction between the princes of England and France over the English lands in France. But the spark was Edward's assertion of a claim to the French crown itself, through his mother, a French princess. Whether Edward truly believed he could win the throne of France, or whether the title was chiefly a weapon and a banner, it gave the war a grand object and a justification, and Edward pressed it with energy, leading armies into France and seeking the great pitched battles in which English skill could tell. For the English had developed a way of war that would prove devastating, built around the longbow, the powerful weapon drawn by the yeomen of England, which, in the hands of massed and disciplined archers, could pour a storm of arrows into an advancing enemy and cut down the armoured knights and horses of the French chivalry before they could close. Yet these dazzling victories proved, in the longer run, to be a kind of trap, for they persuaded the English that the war could be won by battle, when in truth it could not. The French learned slowly and at bitter cost to refuse the set-piece engagements at which the English excelled, and to wear their enemy down instead, by patience, by skirmish and siege, reclaiming a town here and a district there, while the English armies marched and burned, and held nothing that lasted. Each expedition came to cost more than it gained, and the conquests of one generation slipped away in the next, until the glittering promise of those early triumphs dissolved into a long and grinding stalemate that drained the wealth and the manhood of England for decade upon decade. The war that had opened in such glory would close, generations later, in near total defeat. And the dreaded longbow that had once seemed to make England invincible could not, in the end, hold what English valour had won. The armies that won these victories were raised in ways that changed throughout the Plantagenet centuries for the old feudal levy, by which the monarch summoned his barons and they brought their due quotas of knights. Proved too cumbersome and too limited for the protracted wars in France. In its place there grew up the practice of raising armies by contract and by pay, the sovereign or his captains agreeing with lords and knights to serve for wages with a stated number of men for a stated term, so that the armies of the later wars were paid professionals rather than feudal levies, soldiers serving for money and the hope of plunder and ransom. Alongside the mounted men-at-arms marched the archers, drawn from the free common men of the shires, and the whole was bound together by pay and contract and the prospect of profit from a successful campaign. This way of war made the monarch's ability to wage it depend, more than ever, on money, for paid armies had to be paid, and the cost of the major expeditions to France was enormous, driving the sovereigns to the taxation that bound them ever more tightly to the consent of the realm. War in the Plantagenet age was not only the great pitched battles that the chronicles loved to describe, but also the protracted, grinding business of raids and sieges and the devastation of the enemy's country, the burning of crops and villages to ruin his resources and break his will, a hard and a brutal trade for all the chivalry that adorned it. The armies that the Angevin kings led across the Channel were instruments of this trade, raised by contract, paid in coin, sustained by plunder, and the wars they waged beneath the glamour of Crécy and Agincourt were largely a matter of marching and burning and besieging, the slow attrition of the enemy's strength, punctuated by the rare and bloody battles that decided the fate of kingdoms. The weapon that won these famous victories, the longbow, deserves a word of its own, for it was the secret of English success in war for more than a century, and it was, remarkably, the weapon of the humble man. The longbow was a tall bow, as tall as the man who drew it, made most often of yew, and it required enormous strength and long practice to use, for the draw was heavy and the skill hard won. But in the hands of a trained archer, it could send a heavy arrow through armour at a major distance, and a body of such archers, shooting together, could loose a storm of arrows that fell upon an advancing enemy like a deadly rain. It was a weapon that depended not on the riches and birth of the knight, but on the strength and skill of the yeoman, the free common man of England. And it was the disciplined massed shooting of these ordinary archers that broke the proud chivalry of France. So important was the longbow to English war that the practice of archery was encouraged and even required by law, the common men of England being expected to train at the butts on Sundays and holidays, so that the realm should always have a supply of skilled archers ready for war. This made archery part of the very fabric of English life, a national skill and almost a national pastime, and it gave the everyday Englishman a place in war and a source of pride that the common men of other lands did not have. For it was the yeoman archer, not only the noble knight, who won England's victories. The longbow shaped the English way of war, and, in its way, the English sense of themselves. The weapon of the free, humble man that humbled the armoured nobility of the enemy. Its day would pass in time as gunpowder rose, but for the great age of the Plantagenet Wars in France, it was the deadliest weapon on the battlefield, and the legend of the English archer, drawn from the victories of Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, has never quite faded. And in the very midst of these triumphant decades, there fell upon England and all of Europe a catastrophe beside which the wars of rulers seemed small. The coming of the pestilence that later ages would call the Black Death. It came out of the east, a plague of terrible swiftness and mortality, and it swept through Europe and reached England around the middle of the 14th century. And in the space of a year or two, it killed, by the best estimates, something close to a third or even a half of the entire population. No one was spared its terror. It struck down rich and poor, young and old, killing so many so fast that the living could scarcely bury the dead, emptying whole villages, throwing the ordinary life of the kingdom into chaos. It was a disaster on a scale almost impossible to imagine, a dying off of the people such as had never been known, and it changed England profoundly and forever. With so many dead, the labourers who survived found their work suddenly valuable, and the old bonds that had tied the peasant to the land and the lord began to strain and break, as the survivors demanded better terms and freedom of movement that their lords struggled to deny them. The Black Death shook the whole social structure to its roots, and the tensions it set loose would, within a generation, erupt in the greatest popular rising that medieval England ever saw. The world that came after the plague was not the world that had gone before, and these kings, for all their authority, ruled now over a country transformed by death. The pestilence that struck in the middle of the 14th century was unlike anything within living memory or written record. A plague of such swiftness and such deadliness that it seemed to many the very wrath of God or the end of the age. It came, the population believed, out of the distant east, carried along the trade routes, and it moved across Europe with terrible speed, reaching England and sweeping through the crowded and unsanitary towns and the close-packed villages alike, sparing no region and few households. Those it struck sickened and very often died within days, and the sheer number of the dead overwhelmed every custom and every resource of the living, so that the dead were buried in great pits. The dying were abandoned. The priests who tended the sick died with them, and whole communities were emptied. By the best reckoning that can be made, something between a third and a half of the entire population of England perished in the space of a year or two. A mortality so vast that it is hard for us even to grasp. The world that survived the plague was changed in ways that went deep and proved lasting, above all in the relations of the common people to their lords. Before the plague, land was plentiful and subjects many, and the labourer was cheap and bound by custom and law to his lord and his village. After it, with so many dead working hands were suddenly scarce and therefore valuable, and the surviving labourers found that they could demand higher wages and better terms, or simply move away in search of them. Breaking the old bonds of servitude, the lords and the crown fought back with laws to hold wages down and keep the labourer in his place. But the pressure of the new scarcity was against them, and the old order of bondage began slowly to dissolve. The resentment between lords, trying to enforce the old servitude, and commons, determined to claim their new worth, built up over a generation, and it would burst out at last in the great popular rising that shook the reign of the next king. The plague, in killing so many, had loosened the very foundations of the medieval social order, and nothing afterward was quite the same. The people of the 14th century met the horror of the plague with the resources they had, which were the resources of their faith and their limited learning. For the true cause of the pestilence was utterly unknown to them, and beyond the reach of their medicine. The physicians of the age, learned in the medical theories inherited from the ancient world, could do almost nothing against a disease they did not understand. and their remedies, however earnestly applied, were useless against the swift and deadly sickness. In their helplessness, many turned to religion, seeing in the plague the punishment of a wrathful God for the sins of mankind. And the response was often one of frantic piety, of processions and prayers and penance, of desperate appeals to heaven to lift the scourge. Some of this religious response took extreme forms, as bands of penitents wandered the land, scourging themselves in public to appease the divine anger, and darker currents stirred as well, as frightened commons looked for someone to blame and turned, in some lands, upon outsiders and minorities in cruel persecutions. The plague tested the faith in the institutions of the age to their limits, and it left behind not only a transformed economy and society, but a changed spirit, a heightened awareness of death and its nearness, a darkening of the mood of the age that can be felt in its art and its writing. The mighty dying had shown how fragile all human arrangements were, how swiftly the proud and the humble alike could be swept away, and the world that came after carried the memory of that terror. The Plantagenet monarchs ruled, in the later 14th century, over a people that had passed through a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, and the shadow of the terrible pestilence lay over the rest of the dynasty's history, a wound in the life of the nation that took generations to heal. The later years of Edward III's prolonged reign were a slow decline from the glory of its middle, a sad falling away, such as often comes upon reigns that go on too long. The old king sank into age and feebleness, falling under the influence of a grasping mistress, while the war with France, after its triumphant beginnings, began to turn against England as a revived France slowly won back much of what had been lost. And the great hope of the dynasty, the king's eldest son and heir, the famous warrior known to history as the Black Prince, the victor of Poitiers and the very model of a chivalric prince, fell ill with a long and wasting sickness and died before his father, leaving the realm to grieve and to fear for the succession. The death of the Black Prince was a heavy blow, for he had seemed the perfect heir, and his passing left as successor to the throne his own young son, a child, while the old king lingered on in his decay. When Edward III at last died, after a reign of 50 years, he left a realm that had passed its peak, the war going badly, the treasury strained, the social system shaken by the plague, and the crown descending to a boy. The golden age was over, and the troubles that the old king's long success had held at bay were waiting for his small grandson. The marriages of the dynasty's kings and their children were instruments of policy as much as matters of the heart, for a princely marriage was a means of sealing alliances, securing peace, and extending the influence of the dynasty. And the daughters and sons of the royal house were married where the interests of the crown directed. Royal daughters were sent abroad to marry the sovereigns and princes of other lands, carrying the blood of the house into the royal houses of Europe and binding England to foreign powers, while the sons might be matched with major heiresses at home or with foreign princesses to bring alliance or inheritance. These marriages were negotiated with care, the bride or groom often a child when the match was made. The union a matter of treaties and dowries and dynastic calculation rather than of personal choice, for the marriages of the considerable were too important to be left to inclination. The web of marriages spun by the Angevins over the centuries tied them to the ruling houses of Europe and shaped the alliances and the quarrels of the age, and it had momentous consequences. For it was through such a marriage that Edward III gained his right to the throne of France, the claim that launched the lengthy war, his mother being a French princess. The marriages of Edward III's own many children, in particular, had vast consequences for England, for the descendants of his various sons, married into the great families of the realm, became the rival claimants whose quarrels produced the Wars of the Roses, so that the very fruitfulness of the dynasty and the marriages of its members helped, in the end, to destroy it. Marriage was thus both a tool of Plantagenet power and a source of Plantagenet ruin, binding the dynasty to its allies and its rivals, carrying its blood over Europe, and seeding, in the rival lines it created, the dynastic quarrels that would consume it. The royal marriage bed was, in its way, as much a field of policy and consequence as the battlefield, and the matches made by these kings shaped the destiny of the dynasty as surely as their wars. The Black Prince, the crown's eldest son and the hope of the dynasty, was in his prime the very model of the chivalric warrior. The victor of Poitiers, admired across Europe for his prowess and his courtly bearing, and it seemed certain that he would one day be a notable king. But his later career was shadowed, both by the wasting illness that fell upon him and by a darker episode that stained his chivalrous fame, for in a campaign in France, he stormed and sacked a town that had defied him, and the harshness shown to its inhabitants was remembered against him as a cruelty unworthy of so famous a knight. War, even chivalrous war, had its brutal face, and the Black Prince showed it. Then the lengthy sickness took hold of him, some wasting disease contracted on campaign, and the splendid warrior was reduced over decades to an invalid, carried about, unable to lead. Declining slowly toward a death that came before his father's, so that he never wore the crown for which he had seemed so perfectly made. The death of the Black Prince did more than rob the dynasty of its finest soldier. It left the succession resting upon a child, the prince's young son. At the very moment when the old king was sinking into his dotage and could govern no longer. Into the space left by a failing king and an infant heir stepped the king's other sons, the child's uncles, and chief among them, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the richest and most powerful prince in the land. Gaunt was widely distrusted, suspected by many of coveting the throne for himself, and his looming presence over the cradle of the heir-bred faction and fear among those who wondered what he intended. So the dynasty that had stood so high in the middle of the reign came toward the old king's death in a mood of anxiety rather than confidence. Its future balanced on the life of a small boy and shadowed by the ambitions of the grown men who surrounded him. The disputed successions that caused so much of the bloodshed of the Plantagenet age point to a deep problem at the heart of medieval crown, the question of who had the right to the throne when the succession was not clear. In the ordinary way, the crown passed to the eldest son of the dead king by the principle that came to be called primogeniture, and when there was a clear and grown male heir, the succession was usually smooth. But the rule was not always so simple, for what was to be done when a ruler left only a daughter, or only a grandchild, or a young child, or no direct young prince at all? Or when the claims of an elder son's descendants clashed with those of a younger son who was nearer at hand? These were the situations that bred dispute, and dispute over the throne, in an age when power rested ultimately on force, bred war. The whole tragic arc of the dynasty's later history grew from such a tangle, for when the senior descent of the Plantagenets failed with the deposing of Richard II, the crown was seized by the House of Lancaster, descended from a younger son of Edward III, while the descendants of an elder son had, by strict right, the better title. This unresolved flaw in the title of the Lancastrian rulers lay quiet while they were strong, but it waited, and when a weak ruler came in Henry VI, the rival claim of the House of York was raised, and the realm was plunged into the Wars of the Roses. The long struggle between the descendants of the different sons of Edward III. So much grief flowed from the simple difficulty that the rules of succession could not always settle who should be king, and that when they could not, the matter fell to be decided by the sword. The Plantagenet age, for all the majesty of its consecrated the crown, never solved the problem of the succession. And it was that unsolved problem that destroyed the dynasty in the end. The mighty war with France that Edward III had begun so gloriously dragged on, with lengthy truces and renewals, through the reigns of king after king, and it is worth following it to its end, for it ended, after more than 100 years, in the almost total defeat of England. The triumphs of Crécy and Poitiers, and later Agincourt, had seemed at times to put the crown of France within English reach, and under Henry V it had seemed that the two kingdoms might be joined. But the tide turned. The French recovered their strength and their will, and down the protracted reign of the feeble Henry VI, the English were driven steadily back, losing the lands they had won until almost nothing remained. By the time the war at last guttered out around the middle of the 15th century, the English had lost all their great conquests in France, and almost all the older lands they had kept there for centuries, retaining only the single port of Calais on the Channel coast as the last remnant of their continental empire. So the prolonged war that had begun in the reign of Edward III ended, generations later, in the reign of Henry VI, in defeat and the loss of nearly everything. A melancholy conclusion to the major enterprise that had defined so much of the dynasty's history. The loss of France was a bitter humiliation and a heavy blow to the prestige of the crown, and it fed directly into the troubles at home. For the discredit of the defeat helped to bring down the government of Henry VI and to open the way to the Wars of the Roses. The dream of a double monarchy, of the English king reigning over France as well as England. The dream that had drawn the dynasty across the Channel again and again, ended at last in failure, and England was thrown back upon itself, its continental ambitions, save for the foothold at Calais, finally extinguished. The long entanglement with France, which had begun with the very origins of the dynasty in the lands of Anjou and Aquitaine, ended after 3 centuries in defeat and withdrawal, and the energies that had been poured for so long into the French war turned inward, in the dynasty's last act, to the terrible civil strife in which the house destroyed itself. That grandson came to the throne as Richard II, a boy of 10, and his reign would end, like his great-grandfather, Edward II's, in deposition and death, the second Plantagenet king, to be cast down by his own subjects. The reign began in crisis, for only a few years into it, there came the great explosion of popular fury known as the Peasants' Revolt, when the ordinary folk of the southeast, goaded beyond endurance by heavy taxes and by the Lord's attempts to hold them in the old servitude after the plague, rose in their thousands and marched on London. It was a terrifying moment for the ruling structure, the common folk in arms, burning and killing, seizing the city, demanding the end of serfdom and the punishment of the princely ministers, some of whom they caught and beheaded. And in that crisis, the boy King Richard, just 14 years old, showed a flash of extraordinary courage and presence, riding out to meet the rebel host and facing them down in person, making them promises that calmed them and led them to disperse. After which, the rising was put down with the usual harshness and the promises forgotten. It was the notable dramatic moment of Richard's life, and it seemed to promise a bold and capable king. But the promise was not kept, for as Richard grew to manhood, he proved a strange and difficult ruler, proud, extravagant, and convinced of the sacrosanct majesty of his own kingship to a degree that alarmed and angered his mighty nobles. The rising that shook the early decades of Richard's reign, the revolt of the Commons, was the most formidable popular rebellion of the English Middle Ages, and it sprang from the lengthy resentments that the plague had set loose, brought to a head by a hated tax levied on every head in the land. The everyday people of the southeast, labourers and craftsmen goaded beyond endurance by the tax and by the Lord's efforts to hold them in the old servitude, rose in their thousands under leaders such as Wat Tyler and a radical preacher named John Ball, who proclaimed the equality of all men in words that have echoed ever since, asking who had been the gentleman in the days when Adam delved and Eve span. The rebels marched on London, and to the horror of the ruling order, they entered the city, burned the palace of the hated Duke of Lancaster, and seized and beheaded some of the sovereign's chief ministers, whom they blamed for their wrongs. In the crisis, the boy King Richard, only 14 years old, behaved with a courage and a coolness that astonished everyone, riding out to meet the vast host of rebels in person, not once, but twice. At a tense confrontation, the rebel leader Wat Tyler was struck down and killed before the eyes of his followers. And in the dangerous moment that followed, with the crowd on the edge of fury, the young king rode forward alone and called out to them that he would be their leader and their champion, that they should follow him. And by sheer nerve and presence he drew them away and diffused the rising. It was the mighty moment of his life, and it seemed to mark him as a monarch of rare promise. The promises he had made were not kept, of course, and the revolt was put down and its leaders punished with the usual severity. But the old servitude, already dissolving, was never fully restored, and the rising had shown, unforgettably, that the common population could no longer be taken simply for granted. For Richard, the triumph of that day may have done harm as well as good, for it seems to have fixed in him an exalted sense of his own royal office that would, in the end, undo him. As Richard II came into his full power, he ruled in a way that his magnates found more and more intolerable, exalting his own regal dignity, surrounding himself with favourites, striking at the lords who opposed him, and ruling at last in a manner his enemies called tyranny. He took his revenge on the great nobles who had earlier curbed his power, having some killed and others banished, and he ruled by his own will, seeming to set himself above the law and the customs of the realm. Among those he wronged was his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of the monarch's powerful uncle, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. Richard banished Bolingbroke, and when Gaunt died, this prince seized the vast Lancastrian inheritance that should have passed to the exiled Henry, a stroke of confiscation that frightened every landowner in England. For if the sovereign could do this to the greatest of his nobles, no man's property was safe. It was a fatal blunder, for it gave Bolingbroke both a grievance and a cause, and while Richard was away in Ireland, Henry landed in England to reclaim his inheritance, and found the whole nation rallying to him. The thing swelled beyond the recovery of his lands into a bid for the throne itself, and Richard, returning, found himself deserted by all, his power melted away. He was taken, compelled to abdicate, and imprisoned, and there he died, almost certainly murdered, in the year 1399, and with his fall the senior line of the Plantagenets, the direct descent of eldest sons, came to its end. Richard II held a vision of kingship that was loftier and more absolute than his nobles could stomach, for he believed in the sacred and exalted majesty of the crown to a degree that struck his magnates as something close to tyranny. He surrounded himself with favourites, demanded extravagant deference, and nursed a long memory for those who had crossed him. Above all, a group of mighty lords who, earlier in the reign, had risen against his favourites and curbed his power, even putting some of his friends to death. Richard never forgave them, and when he judged himself strong enough, he struck back with a cold and patient vengeance, having the chief of these old enemies killed or banished or destroyed, and ruling thereafter in a high-handed manner that frightened the whole political nation. Raising forced loans, punishing his foes, and seeming to set his own will above the law and custom of the realm. The exalted style of royal rule that Richard II cultivated, which so alarmed his nobles, drew on the deep medieval sense of the sacredness and majesty of the crown, pushed to an extreme that his subjects found intolerable. Richard surrounded his person with an elaborate ceremony, demanded forms of address and gestures of submission that exalted his royal dignity, and seems to have brooded much on the holy character of his hallowed kingship, the God-given authority that set him above other men. There was, in this, nothing wholly new, for all medieval monarchs claimed a hallowed command and surrounded themselves with ceremony. But Richard carried it to a height that, combined with his arbitrary acts and his vengefulness, made his rule seem a tyranny. The will of an anointed sovereign who held himself above the law and the custom of the realm. The tragedy of Richard was that he grasped the theory of the crown, the sacred majesty of the consecrated crown, without the practical wisdom to make it safe, for a king might write all the consecrated dignity he liked. But if he frightened and alienated the mighty men on whose support his might ultimately rested, his majesty would not save him. Richard's exalted notions did not protect him when he had turned the nobility against him by his arbitrary acts and, above all, by the fatal seizure of the Lancastrian inheritance. The sacrosanct king was deposed and done to death like his great-grandfather before him, his majesty proving no shield against the hard realities of power. His fall illustrates the central tension of kingship between the sacred ideal of the hallowed sovereign, owed obedience as God's deputy, and the practical truth that a monarch who lost the confidence of his nobles and his people could be brought down whatever his holy claims. Richard believed too much in the theory and attended too little to the practice, and it destroyed him. The most self-consciously majestic of monarchs ending as a deposed and murdered prisoner. The depositions that punctuated the Plantagenet age had a terrible significance beyond the fate of the individual monarchs, for each one made the next a little more thinkable. And the unmaking of sovereigns, once it had been done, could be done again. When Edward II was deposed and murdered, it was a shocking novelty, the first such overthrow of an anointed sovereign since the Norman conquest. An act that the men who did it took great care to clothe in forms of law and consent, fearful of the sacrilege of laying hands on the Lord's consecrated. But once it had been done, the unthinkable had become possible, and when, generations later, Richard II made himself intolerable to his nobles, the precedent was there, and he too was deposed and done to death, the next king to be so unmade. And the unmaking did not stop there, for the deposition of Richard II and the seizure of the throne by the House of Lancaster set in train the disputes that led to the Wars of the Roses, in which rulers were made and unmade and killed with a dreadful frequency, the crown changing hands by force again and again. Once the spell of the inviolable hallowed king had been broken, once it had been shown that a ruler could be cast down and destroyed by his subjects, the way was open to the cycle of usurpation and counter-usurpation that marked the dynasty's bloody end. Each deposition weakened the awe that had protected the crown, made the next easier to contemplate, until in the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, the throne became a prize to be seized by whoever had the dominion, and king followed king to the throne and the grave in swift and violent succession. The breaking of the sanctity of royal office, begun with Edward II, was one of the slow tragedies of the Plantagenet age, for it loosed a violence against the crown itself that the dynasty, in the end, could not survive. The sacred office becoming the spoil of the strongest, until the last of the succession was cut down in battle and his crown passed to another house. The seizure of the Lancastrian inheritance was the act that ruined Richard, and it is worth understanding why it frightened the political nation so deeply. The whole order of the realm rested on the security of inherited property, on the certainty that a man's lands would pass to his heir, and if the king could set that aside at his pleasure, confiscating the greatest inheritance in the land on no better ground than his own will, then no estate in England was safe, and the law itself was worth little. In striking at his cousin's birthright, Richard had struck at the principle that protected every landowner alike and had turned a private grievance into a public terror. It was this, more than any single act of his tyranny, that dissolved his support when the test came. For men who might have stood by an anointed king would not risk all to defend a ruler who had shown that he respected no man's rights. When the reckoning came, he was not so much overthrown as abandoned. Deserted by a realm that had ceased to believe its property or its laws were safe in his keeping. For the man who took Richard's throne, Henry Bolingbroke, who became King Henry IV, was a Plantagenet too, but of a younger branch, the House of Lancaster, descended from a younger son of Edward III, and his seizure of the crown opened a new and troubled chapter in the dynasty's history. Henry IV was an able and a wary man, but he had taken the throne by usurpation and the deposing of a hallowed sovereign, and that original sin haunted his reign. For he spent much of it putting down the rebellions of those who challenged his right or resented his rule, and he aged and sickened early under the strain of holding what he had seized. But his son would prove a king of an altogether different and more dazzling kind, and it is to him and to the brief blaze of triumph and tragedy that he brought upon the house that we must turn next. The rebellions that consumed Henry IV's reign were not random outbreaks, but the price of the way he had come to the throne, and they sprang up on every side. In Wales, a charismatic leader raised a long and formidable revolt that the king could never quite stamp out. In the north, the powerful Percy family, who had done so much to set him on the throne, turned against him in resentment, and their famous warrior son, called Hotspur, fell in a hard-fought battle against the lord he had once served. Behind these risings lay a deeper doubt, for there were those who whispered that the rightful line ran not through Henry's branch at all, but through the descendants of an elder son of Edward III, a flaw in the Lancastrian title that would lie quiet for a generation and then help to tear the realm apart. Worn down by the ceaseless struggle and by a wasting sickness, his enemies were pleased to call the judgment of heaven upon an usurper. Henry aged before his time and died having held his throne to the end, but never quite believing it safe beneath him. His son, Henry V, was a wholly different and a more dazzling figure, one of the famous warrior rulers of English history, who as a young man had been wild by the legends, but who came to the throne transformed into a ruler of formidable seriousness, piety and purpose. He took up again the old claim to France and the old war, and he prosecuted it with a skill and a determination that brought England its greatest triumphs since the days of Edward III. The crown of his achievement was the Battle of Agincourt, where his army, small and sick and weary after a long campaign, was brought to battle by a vast French host, and in a few hours of desperate fighting in the mud, the English archers and men-at-arms destroyed the flower of French chivalry in a victory so complete that it became at once the stuff of legend. Agincourt made Henry the master of France in all but title. By a later treaty, he was recognised as heir to the French crown and married the French king's daughter, and it seemed that the two kingdoms would be joined under his line. But Henry V died young, of disease, on campaign in France, at the very summit of his success, leaving an infant son to inherit 2 crowns and a war, and his early death was a catastrophe whose consequences would destroy his house. The infant who inherited the 2 crowns became Henry VI, and his long, sad reign was the unravelling of everything his father had won and the prelude to the dynasty's self-destruction. He grew into a gentle, pious, well-meaning man, wholly unfit to rule, prone to spells of a deep mental collapse in which he knew no one and could do nothing. The very opposite of the hard, commanding kings a medieval realm required. Under his feeble hand, the conquests in France were lost, one by one, as a revived France, inspired in part by the extraordinary career of a peasant girl who believed God had sent her to save her land, drove the English back until almost nothing remained of all that Henry V had won. And as the war abroad was lost, the realm at home fell into faction and disorder, the powerful nobles forming rival parties around the helpless monarch, struggling for control of a government that the monarch himself could not provide. Into this vacuum of royal weakness came the ambition of the sovereign's mighty kinsman, Richard, Duke of York, who had a claim to the throne of his own and a growing conviction that he, and not the favourites around the broken Henry, should rule. The realm divided between the supporters of the sovereign, the House of Lancaster, and the supporters of the Duke of York, and the long, bitter, dynastic struggle that resulted is the conflict we know as the Wars of the Roses. The loss of France, which unravelled all of Henry V's conquests, owed much to a sudden revival of French resistance, and at the heart of that revival stood one of the most extraordinary figures of the entire age. A peasant girl from the eastern marches of France, who believed that God had sent her to drive out the English and see the French king crowned. Whatever one makes of her visions, her effect was real and astonishing, for she put new heart into the broken French cause, raised the siege of a mighty city, and saw the French king crowned in the traditional place, turning the tide of the war. She was captured in time and handed to the English, and burned as a heretic, but the cause she had revived rolled on, and the English, leaderless and divided at home under their helpless king, were driven steadily back, losing town after town and province after province until almost nothing remained of all that Henry V had won. The protracted French war, begun in glory under Edward III, ended at last in near total defeat. A bitter humiliation that discredited the government of Henry VI and fed the discontent at home. What made the crisis so dangerous was that the king's incapacity left no one clearly in charge, and the great men of the court closed ranks to keep power in their own hands. Chief among the defenders of the royal cause was not the king at all, but his queen, the fierce and able Margaret of Anjou, who took up her husband's authority and her son's inheritance with all the iron that Henry lacked, and who came to regard the Duke of York as the deadliest threat to both. York, for his part, found himself shut out from the counsels of a court that feared him, his loyal service unrewarded, and his royal blood a standing reproach to the feeble king it could not displace. It was the collision of these two. The queen resolved to hold everything for her son, and the duke resolved not to be destroyed. That turned a quarrel over the keeping of a broken king into a war for the crown itself. Behind the wars and the dynastic struggles lay the prosperity that paid for them, and the wealth of England rested above all on one thing: on wool, the chief staple of the country's trade and the foundation of its prosperity. The sheep that grazed the pastures of England produced wool of a quality prized throughout Europe, and the export of that wool, above all, to the great cloth-making towns of Flanders, was the richest trade of the realm and the chief source of its fortune, so that it was said the wealth of England rode on the back of the sheep. The crown drew a rich revenue from the customs levied on the export of wool, and this revenue, growing with the trade, became one of the most important supports of royal finance, helping to pay for the wars and the splendours of the Plantagenet monarchs. The importance of wool shaped the policy and even the wars of the age, for the trade tied England closely to Flanders, whose weavers depended on English wool, and the alliances and quarrels arising from that connection played their part in the war with France. The wool trade made the fortunes of merchants, built the fine churches of the wool towns, and filled the treasury of the crown. And it was, in a quiet way, as important to the history of the age as the battles and the rulers. For it was the riches of the wool that paid for so much of what the house did. The soaring churches raised by the profits of the trade, the so-called wool churches, still stand in the old wool districts as monuments to that prosperity, and the very seat of the presiding officer of the House of Lords, a Major Woolsack, recalls to this day the foundation of England's medieval wealth. Behind the glamour of crusade and chivalry and subjugation lay the humble sheep and the merchants who traded in its wool. The true and unglamorous source of much of the power and the splendour of the Plantagenet crown. The Wars of the Roses were a series of wars fought over some 30 years between these two branches of the Plantagenet family. The House of Lancaster and the House of York, both descended from Edward III, each claiming the throne, and they were fought with a savagery made worse by the fact that it was a quarrel within a single family. The crown changed hands more than once as the tide of battle turned. The Duke of York was killed, but his son took up the claim and won the throne as Edward IV, a tall and capable and warlike king who for a time put the House of York firmly in authority. Yet the wars flared up again and again, with treacheries and reversals, exiles and returns, the chief lords changing sides, the most powerful of them, the Earl of Warwick, making and unmaking sovereigns until he was killed in battle. Edward IV kept the throne in the end and died in his bed, but the peace he left was an illusion, for on his death the crown passed to his young son, a boy. And that boy and his younger brother vanished into the Tower of London, never to be seen again, while their uncle took the throne as Richard III in one of the most controversial usurpations in English history. The fate of those two boys, the princes in the Tower, remains the most haunting mystery of the whole age, and it blackened the surname of the monarch who profited by their disappearance, whatever the truth of it, which we shall probably never know. The wars were fought in a series of battles spread over 3 decades, with prolonged pauses between the bursts of fighting, and they were marked by a savagery and a faithlessness made worse by the fact that the combatants were all of one family and one nobility, cousins and kinsmen destroying one another for the crown. The Duke of York, who had claimed the throne, was killed in battle, and his head, crowned in mockery with paper, was set upon the walls of the city of York. But his cause did not die, for his eldest son, a tall and able and ruthless young man, took up the title and won a crushing victory at Towton, fought in a snowstorm and reckoned the bloodiest battle ever waged on English soil, and was crowned as Edward IV. For a time the House of York seemed triumphant, but the wars were not over, for the mighty Earl of Warwick, who had done so much to make Edward king, fell out with him and turned against him, driving him briefly from the throne and restoring the old King Henry before Edward returned, defeated and killed Warwick in battle, and recovered his crown for good. Edward IV held the throne through the rest of his life and died in his bed, leaving the crown to his young son, but the peace he left collapsed at once in the most notorious episode of the whole bloody age. The dead king's brother, Richard of Gloucester, took the young king and his younger brother into his keeping, placed them in the Tower of London, and had himself declared king as Richard III, while the two boys, the rightful king and his brother, disappeared from view and were never seen again. The fate of the princes in the Tower is the darkest mystery of the age, for it has never been proven what came to be of them, though the strong suspicion of murder fell upon their uncle, who had most to gain, and the shadow of it blackened his name and weakened his hold on the loyalty of his subjects. Whatever the truth which is lost to us, the disappearance of the two boys cleared Richard's path to the throne and stained his reign from its beginning, and it left the House of York divided and distrusted at the very moment when a challenger was preparing to strike. And so we come to the end, to the last of the Angevin kings and the field on which the dynasty died. For Richard III, having taken the throne amid suspicion and blood, retained it only 2 years before he was challenged by the last hope of the House of Lancaster, a Welsh-descended exile named Henry Tudor. The two met at last in the year 1485 at a place in the Midlands called Bosworth, and there, in the battle that ended an age, Richard III was deserted by part of his army, cut down fighting, and killed. The last English king to die in battle. By the tradition that has come down to us, his crown was found afterward in the field, caught, the story says, in a thorn bush, and set upon the head of the victor, who became King Henry VII, the first of the Tudors. With Richard's death on Bosworth Field, the long rule of the Angevins came to its end, after 331 years, and a new dynasty took the throne, one that would heal the lengthy division by marrying the successor of York to the new Lancastrian king and joining the warring Roses at last. So ended the house that had ruled England longer than any before it or since. Its last king cut down upon the field, and its 3 centuries of dominion brought at a single stroke of arms to nothing. The challenger who came against Richard III was Henry Tudor, a man of Welsh and Lancastrian descent who had spent decades in exile abroad. The last hope of the broken house of Lancaster and the gathering point for all who were disaffected with Richard's rule. He landed in Wales, drew support as he marched, and met Richard at last on a field in the Midlands near the town of Market Bosworth, where the two armies drew up for the battle that would decide the throne and end an age. The fighting turned on treachery for a powerful lord whose forces might have decided the day held back, and then threw his weight against the sovereign. And Richard, seeing himself deserted and betrayed, chose to stake everything on a desperate charge to cut down his rival in person. He fought, by all accounts, with considerable courage, hacking his way toward Henry Tudor through the press. But he was surrounded and overwhelmed and cut down, dying sword in hand. The last English king to fall in battle, and the last of the protracted Plantagenet line to wear the crown. The badges and the arms under which these rulers and their followers fought carried great meaning in an age that spoke fluently the language of heraldry, and the very name of the Wars of the Roses comes from such badges. The red rose said to stand for the House of Lancaster, and the white rose for the House of York. Heraldry, the system of coloured arms and symbols by which noble families and individuals were identified, was a serious and an elaborate business in the Plantagenet age. For in an age where many could not read, and where armoured men were hard to tell apart, the painted arms on a shield or a banner proclaimed who a man was, and the badges worn by his followers showed whom they served. The royal arms of England themselves, the golden leopards or lions on their red field, became one of the symbols of the throne, later quartered with the lilies of France, when these kings laid claim to the French crown. These symbols were not mere decoration, but carried real weight, expressing claims and loyalties and identities in a form that all could understand, so that to display the arms of England, quartered with those of France, was to proclaim the right to the French throne, and to wear the badge of a notable lord was to declare oneself his man. The roses that gave their name to the mighty civil war were such badges, emblems of the rival houses, and the joining of the red rose and the white into a single combined rose by the dynasty that followed was a piece of heraldic symbolism proclaiming the union of the warring houses and the healing of their quarrel. In the language of heraldry, the whole drama of the dynasty could be traced, the claims and the alliances and the rivalries set out in colour and symbol, and the badges and the arms of the Plantagenets, the leopards and the lilies and the roses, remain among the most enduring images of the English Middle Ages, the visible signs of a vanished world of lordship and loyalty and dynastic war. What ended at Bosworth was not merely a reign but an age, for the fall of Richard III is often taken as the close of the English Middle Ages themselves. The last time an English king would ride into battle and die there with his sword in his hand. The broomflower badge that the family had worn for 3 centuries gave way now to new emblems, and the very name of the dynasty passed out of use among the living. As for the fallen king, his body was carried from the field and buried without ceremony or honour in a nearby town. And his resting place was so utterly forgotten that for centuries afterward, no one could say for certain where the last of the line lay. The bones of a man who had worn the crown of England, vanishing almost without trace into the earth he had ruled. So the house that had given England 14 kings and shaped its laws and its language and its very landscape passed, at the last, out of power and into legend. When we look back across the whole vast span of the Plantagenet age, what stays with us, I think, is the sheer scale of it, the 3 centuries and more of restless, brilliant, violent monarchs who made England what it proved. They were a family of extraordinary force, for good and ill, and they left their mark on everything. It was under the house that the common law took shape, that Parliament was born and grew, that the vast cathedrals and castles rose, that the English language climbed back from the conquest to become once more the tongue of court and realm. They fought the Crusades and the prolonged wars with France. They conquered Wales and grappled with Scotland. They were brought to heel by Magna Carta and shaken by the Black Death and the risings of their own subjects. And at the last they tore themselves apart in the Wars of the Roses, the family destroying itself in the struggle for the crown it had kept so long. Few dynasties in the history of any country can show so long a lineage, so many remarkable figures, so great a legacy of institutions and buildings and law, mingled with so much blood and treachery and grief. They were the makers of medieval England, this strange and mighty family, and the kingdom they shaped outlived them and remembers them still. Though the dynasty ended at Bosworth, the blood of the Angevins did not vanish from the throne, for it flowed on into the line that supplanted them and runs, in truth, in the princely house to this day. The first Tudor king secured his hold and united the warring houses by marrying the heir of the House of York, a granddaughter of the Plantagenet descent, so that their children, and all the sovereigns descended from them, carried the blood of the old dynasty in their veins. The Tudors who followed, and the dynasties that came after them, were thus descended, through that marriage, from the Plantagenets they had replaced. And the long line of English and later British sovereigns traces back, through many channels, to the Angevin kings and beyond. In this sense, the dynasty did not truly die at Bosworth. Its blood was absorbed into the house that followed, and lived on in the royal succession. So the Plantagenets, who ruled England in their own name for 331 years, live on in their descendants upon the throne, and their mark upon the country is everywhere still, in the law and the parliament and the language and the universities that took shape in their age, in the cathedrals and the castles that rise across the land, in the very memory and imagination of the English past. They were a family of extraordinary force and extraordinary contradiction, lawgivers and tyrants, crusaders and murderers, builders and destroyers, who raised England to greatness and tore it apart in civil war, and who left, when their rule was ended, on Bosworth Field, a nation profoundly shaped by their 3 centuries of restless ambition. Few dynasties anywhere have left so deep a mark, or lived so vividly in the memory of the nation they ruled, and the long line of the Plantagenets. From its obscure beginnings among the warlords of the Loire to its violent end upon an English battlefield, remains one of the great stories of the nation's past, the tale of the family that made medieval England and was, at the last, destroyed by the very crown for which it had striven so long. The institutions that took shape under the house are perhaps their greatest and most lasting legacy, for it was across these 3 centuries that much of the framework of English public life was built. The common law, the law humble to the whole realm and administered in the sovereign's courts, grew from the reforms of Henry II into a major and distinctive system that would spread, in time, over much of the world. Parliament, born of the need of sovereigns to seek the consent of the realm to taxation and growing through the crises of baronial revolt, developed from an occasional assembly of magnates into a regular institution with its commons of knights and burgesses. The ancestor of the parliaments of later ages, Magna Carta, wrung from a hated monarch, became the touchstone of the principle that the crown itself was subject to the law. These were not designed as a system by any single mind. They grew often out of conflict and crisis. Across the lengthy Plantagenet centuries, but they grew into the enduring foundations of English government. And there was more than institutions, for the age of the Plantagenets saw the very identity of England take a lasting shape. The English language, driven underground at the Norman conquest, and all but banished from court and government in favour of French, climbed slowly back across these centuries until, by the later medieval period, it had returned as the tongue of king and council and law. Transformed and enriched by its centuries in shadow, but recognisably the ancestor of the speech we use today. It was in these years too that English began once more to carry a literature of its own, and that the people of the realm came increasingly to think of themselves as one nation with one tongue set apart from the French against whom they fought so long. That slow forging of an English identity, half hidden beneath the wars and the dynastic quarrels, may be counted among the quietest and the most enduring of all the bequests of the age. So let us leave them there, the Plantagenets. Their rule ended at last on Bosworth Field, their roses joined at last in the dynasty that followed, their 300 years of glory and blood passing into the long memory of England. I hope this journey across the centuries has carried you far from your own night, into the deep past of strongholds and sovereigns and the slow turning of the ages. The way these old stories can, when you let them take you. If these evenings are something you would like to return to, you are always welcome to subscribe and to come and travel another stretch of history on another night. Whenever the present grows too loud, and you would rather be a few centuries away, there is no hurry in it. The stories will keep, and so will I. For all the majesty of their office, the dynasty's rulers were mortal men, and it is worth remembering, at the close, that behind the crowned figures of the chronicles were living people, with their strengths and their frailties, their illnesses and their fears, their deaths often hard. They were warriors who bore the wounds of war, like Richard the Lionheart struck down by a crossbow bolt, and men subject to the sicknesses of the age against which their rank was no defence, like the Black Prince wasted by a long disease, or Henry V carried off by sickness at the height of his might, or Henry VI sunk in the darkness of his mind. The carved effigies that lie upon their tombs show them in the calm dignity of death. But the lives behind those serene images were often turbulent and sometimes terrible, ending in defeat or deposition or murder as often as in peace. There is an old idea that the ruler had, as it were, two bodies, the mortal body of the man, who would sicken and die like any other, and the undying body of the crown and the office, which passed on unbroken from one king to the next, so that men cried that the sovereign was dead, and in the same breath that the monarch lived, the office surviving the man. The Plantagenet age shows us both of these. The immortal crown passing down the generations of the dynasty, and the all-too-mortal men who wore it, the living commons who were born and ruled and suffered and died throughout the protracted centuries of the lineage. To remember them as men, as well as princes, frail and mortal beneath their majesty, is perhaps the truest way to take our leave of them. This protracted succession of human beings raised to the highest place and bearing its burdens and its dangers, who lived and died across 300 years and more, and who were, for all their crowns, as mortal as the rest of us, and are now as long asleep as all the dead of that far-off age. For now, let your thoughts go loose. Let the monarchs and the castles and the broom flower and the slow roll of the centuries drift apart and dissolve. The way the day dissolves when sleep at last comes for it, You do not need to hold on to any of it. Let the battles fade, and the crowns grow dim, and the quiet rise up around you, and let yourself sink down into it, slowly, with nothing left to do and nowhere left to be. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.